The Sunday afternoon of March 4th, 2018 settled over Salisbury with the kind of pale, indifferent light that belongs to late English winter. The sky above the cathedral city was the color of old pewter, neither threatening rain nor promising sun, simply present in the way that February and March skies in the south of England so often are, flat and colorless and seemingly permanent, as though the warmth of spring existed only as a rumor passed between people who had grown too hopeful. The streets of the city center were quiet, as they tend to be on Sunday afternoons when the morning markets have packed away their stalls and the lunch crowds have retreated indoors. A few shoppers drifted through the Maltings, the open-air shopping precinct that runs alongside the River Avon, their footsteps unhurried, their breath faintly visible in the cold air. Pigeons picked at crumbs near the benches. The cathedral spire rose above the rooftops in the middle distance, ancient and unchanging, its 123 meters of stone and ambition pointing skyward with all the quiet authority of 9 centuries of accumulated presence. At approximately 4:15 in the afternoon, a nurse named Freya Church was walking through the Maltings when she noticed 2 people slumped on a bench outside the shopping center. The man was older, solidly built, dressed in a dark jacket. The woman beside him appeared considerably younger, and both of them were in a state that went well beyond fatigue or illness. Their eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing in particular. Their postures were rigid. Their limbs were unresponsive in the particular way that suggests the body has been seized by something beyond simple incapacity. A small terrier sat at their feet, confused but patient, reluctant to leave its owner no matter how wrong everything had clearly become. Freya Church had medical training, and she recognized immediately that this required the emergency services. She crouched beside the couple, assessed what she could, and made the call. Then she stayed with them, doing the quiet, essential work of keeping 2 human beings anchored to consciousness and to breathing until the ambulances arrived. She had no way of knowing, in that moment, that the man on the bench was a former colonel in Russian military intelligence. She had no way of knowing that the substance working through his nervous system was a compound so precisely and deliberately lethal that it had been designed by a state military program to be resistant to standard medical countermeasures. She simply saw 2 people who were dying in the open air on a Sunday afternoon, and she did what she could. The man's name was Sergei Viktorovich Skripal. He was 66 years old, and he had been living quietly in Salisbury for the better part of 8 years. His companion was his daughter Yulia, 33 years old, who had flown in from Moscow a few days earlier for what was meant to be a pleasant weekend visit. They had spent part of the afternoon feeding bread to the ducks at the Queen Elizabeth Gardens, an activity that Sergei apparently enjoyed with a straightforwardness that had nothing to do with tradecraft or cover stories. He simply liked feeding ducks. They had eaten lunch at Zitzi, an Italian restaurant in the city center. They had stopped afterward for a drink at the Mill pub on the riverbank, where the afternoon light came off the water through the windows and the conversations around them were the ordinary Sunday conversations of ordinary English people. Football scores, where they planned to holiday, whether the roast had been better last week or the week before. Then they had made their way toward the shopping area, and somewhere between the pub and the car they had sat down on a bench and not got up again. Yulia Skripal, accounts later confirmed, had tried to call out for help when she felt herself losing control of her body. The words had not come properly. Something in the machinery that translates thought into speech had already begun to fail. She had managed to communicate distress in a way that someone nearby noticed, though by that point Freya Church had already spotted them and the emergency response was already in motion. The ambulances arrived. Paramedics assessed the couple and made decisions quickly. This was serious in a way that demanded resources, demanded the hospital, demanded everything available. They were transferred with urgency. Their conditions deteriorated during transit. Sergei Skripal was critical by the time he reached Salisbury District Hospital. His pupils were constricted to near pinpoints. His muscles were locked. He was drenched in sweat. His breathing was labored and becoming more so by the minute. Yulia was in a condition only slightly less severe. Her respiratory system was under the same assault. Both of them were fighting their own bodies, and their bodies were fighting back with a thoroughness that the medical staff of a mid-sized English county hospital had simply never encountered. The physicians who received them worked with everything available. They did not yet know what they were dealing with. The presentation was consistent with organophosphate poisoning, the class of chemical compounds that include certain pesticides and, at the extreme end of the spectrum, military-grade nerve agents, but Salisbury District Hospital was not a facility that routinely prepared for nerve agent attacks. It served a catchment area of roughly 250,000 people across Wiltshire, a county of chalk downlands and market towns and prehistoric monuments, a county whose emergency medicine dealt with the usual range of rural and suburban emergencies. Nerve agents were not within the standard frame of reference, but the symptoms were unmistakable to anyone who had been trained to recognize them, and one of the senior physicians on duty that evening had the knowledge to identify the pattern. Organophosphates work by disabling acetylcholinesterase, the enzyme the nervous system relies on to switch off signals between nerve cells and muscles. Without it, the signals accumulate without interruption. The nervous system floods. The muscles receive a continuous command to contract. The glands pour out secretions that cannot be regulated. The lungs fill with fluid. The heart struggles to maintain its rhythm. The body's most fundamental automatic processes, breathing, heartbeat, the management of its own chemistry, begin to collapse in sequence. There are antidotes. Atropine can block the flood of signals. Pralidoxime can attempt to restore the disabled enzyme if given quickly enough. These were administered. The medical team worked through the night. Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey of Wiltshire Police was among the first officers who had responded to the initial call at the Maltings. Standard police response to a medical emergency involving an address meant checking the home as well, and Bailey had attended the house on Christy Miller Road as part of that process. He had touched surfaces in the house. He had moved through rooms where molecules too small to see and too potent to comprehend had settled on the things that people touch without thinking. Door handles, the edges of rooms, the ambient surfaces of a domestic life. In the days that followed, Bailey would fall gravely ill. He would spend weeks in intensive care. He would survive eventually, but the road back would be long and would cost him more than he could have anticipated. Within 2 days of the Skripals collapse, analysts at the Defense Science and Technology Laboratory at Portondown had made an identification. Portondown's facilities sit roughly 11 kilometers from the center of Salisbury, close enough that on a clear day the cathedral spire is visible from the road outside its perimeter fence. The laboratory has been at the center of British chemical and biological defense research since the First World War, and its scientists have levels of expertise in chemical agents that exist in very few places on Earth. What they identified in the samples taken from the Skripals was a nerve agent of the Novichok class. A compound so specifically engineered, of a purity so high, that its manufacture required state-level resources, state-level facilities, and state-level intent. This was not an accident. This was not industrial contamination. This was a weapon, deployed deliberately against 2 specific people on a bench in an English city on a Sunday afternoon. The scale of what had happened took time to fully register, even among those who were told immediately. The intelligence and security services of the United Kingdom had dealt with Russian aggression before. The Litvinenko poisoning in London in 2006 was a case that still resonated through the institutions, but this was different in ways that mattered. This was not polonium in a teacup at a luxury hotel. This was a military-grade nerve agent applied to a residential door handle in a market town in Wiltshire, in a country with which Russia maintained at least the formal courtesies of diplomatic relations, used against a man who had been legally exchanged and was living under what amounted to an informal understanding that he would be left alone. The rules, such as they were, had been violated in a manner so deliberate, so public, and so dangerous to innocent bystanders that the implications would take weeks to fully work through. A former Russian spy, living quietly in a cathedral city in England, feeding ducks on a Sunday afternoon, and 2 Russian nationals who had already flown home by the time the ambulances arrived. A military-grade nerve agent on a door handle. A detective who simply checked the house and nearly died for it. And a question that pointed directly at the Kremlin, even as Moscow denied everything. If this kind of operation, brazen, state-sanctioned, conducted in plain daylight on English streets, is the reason you watch this channel, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. The investigation that followed is meticulous, and it leads somewhere. But that reckoning would come later. In those first hours, the city outside the hospital continued its Sunday evening as though nothing had changed. Families ate dinner. Children were put to bed. Pubs filled and murmured their way toward closing time. The cathedral told its hours into the cold night air, as it had been doing for centuries, indifferent to events below. The people of Salisbury, for the most part, did not yet know what had happened in their streets that afternoon. They did not yet know that the bench in the Maltings had become, in a few hours, one of the most significant crime scenes in British intelligence history. To understand why a man ended up on that bench, who put him there, and what drove an entire state apparatus to dispatch a murder team to a quiet English city, you have to go back a great many years. You have to go back to the Cold War and to the specific world that formed him. You have to understand the organization he served, the organization he later betrayed, and the culture that regards betrayal as something that time and distance can never actually extinguish. Because the story of the Salisbury poisoning is not only the story of an attack. It is the story of a man who made a choice decades earlier, and of a government that kept a patient and meticulous record of that choice, and of what happens when those two forces finally meet again in a place as unlikely, as ordinary, as beautiful, and as unsuspecting as this. Sergei Viktorovich Skripal was born on June 23, 1951, in Kaliningrad, the Russian exclave that sits on the Baltic coast wedged between Poland and Lithuania in a geographic arrangement that seems, on any map, to require explanation. Kaliningrad was not always Russian. For centuries it was Königsberg, the capital of the Duchy of Prussia, the city where Immanuel Kant was born and died without ever leaving, the site of one of the great medieval castles of the Teutonic Knights. The Second World War destroyed much of it, and the Soviet Union's post-war settlement destroyed the rest. Not the buildings this time, but the identity, the history, the German memory of the place. The original population was expelled. Russian settlers were brought in. Streets were renamed. The castle was demolished. A concrete Soviet office building was erected in its place. The city was declared closed to foreign visitors and scrubbed, as thoroughly as a place can be scrubbed of its former self. Growing up in Kaliningrad in the 1950s and 1960s meant growing up in a city built on erasure, in a place that demonstrated, through its very stones and streets, what it meant when the state decided to rewrite the world it inhabited. The lessons of that environment shaped people in ways they often did not recognize until much later, if ever. For Sergei Skripal, Kaliningrad was simply home, the place where he went to school, where he learned to navigate the particular rhythms of Soviet provincial life, where the rhythms of the military were part of the ambient music of his childhood. Kaliningrad was, and remains, one of the most heavily militarized pieces of territory in Europe. It hosts significant Russian military forces, including naval assets and, in more recent decades, missile systems. The military was not merely present in Kaliningrad, it was foundational, the organizing principle around which civilian life arranged itself. Skripal entered the Soviet military as a young man and proved himself capable enough to enter the airborne forces, the VDV Vozdushnodesantnaya Voyska, the paratroopers who occupied in Soviet military culture the same elevated position of elite warrior identity that airborne forces tend to occupy in most military traditions. Service in the airborne was demanding, selective, and carried a distinction that shaped the careers of those who passed through it. He rose through the ranks with the methodical competence of someone who had understood, from an early age, what the institutions around him expected and how to provide it. He was not, by the accounts that emerged after his exposure, a particularly ideological figure in any rigid or passionate sense. He was a professional, a man who had chosen a career within a structure and who pursued advancement within that structure with the quiet intelligence of someone who understood how systems worked. The transition from military service proper to the GRU, the Glavnoy Razvedavatelnoy Upravlenie, the main intelligence directorate of the Soviet armed forces, was a natural progression for an officer of his caliber and background. The GRU was, and remains, Russia's military intelligence agency, and it operated through the Cold War as a parallel intelligence structure alongside the civilian agencies of the KGB. This distinction matters more than it might initially appear. The KGB was the ideological and political police force. It watched Soviet citizens, ran counterintelligence operations, maintained the domestic instruments of control, and conducted foreign intelligence operations through its own separate networks. The GRU, by contrast, was the military's intelligence arm. It collected information on foreign military capabilities, ran agents inside defense establishments and armed forces, stole weapons secrets and technical specifications, and gave the military command its picture of what potential adversaries could and could not do in a conflict. The two organizations competed intensely. They had separate budgets, separate networks, separate chains of command, and separate institutional cultures that did not always produce mutual respect. KGB officers tended to regard GRU counterparts with a certain professional condescension. GRU officers returned it. The rivalry was managed rather than resolved, generating a fractured intelligence bureaucracy that successive Soviet and Russian leaders found useful precisely because divided institutions are easier to control. Neither agency could accumulate enough independent power to threaten the political leadership as long as they were expending a portion of their energy watching each other. By the early 1990s, Skripal had reached the rank of colonel in the GRU. He was working in areas connected to personnel administration, the management of GRU officers, the records of who served where, who operated under which cover, who had been posted to which embassy or residency under diplomatic alias. In the intelligence trade, access to personnel information of this kind is extraordinarily valuable. If you know the identities of officers in a foreign intelligence service, the real names behind the diplomatic cover stories, the organizational positions behind the civilian job descriptions, you have acquired something that can take years of expensive, patient work to develop through other means. Personnel records are among the most carefully guarded intelligence holdings any service possesses, precisely because their compromise has such cascading consequences. It was this access, this specific position within a specific part of the GRU's administrative structure, that made Skripal an object of interest to the British Secret Intelligence Service MI6, known internally as SIS, headquartered in the angular modern building on the south bank of the Thames in Vauxhall that is, with some irony, one of the most photographed and recognizable intelligence headquarters on Earth. The precise circumstances of his initial approach remain classified. The account that has emerged through court proceedings, investigative journalism, and the partial declassifications that follow major espionage cases is that contact was established around 1995, while Skripal was serving in some capacity connected to a foreign posting. His MI6 handler was a professional who operated under the working name Pablo Miller, a man who would, years later, be living in the same city as Skripal, a detail that would itself become a thread in the subsequent investigation. Why did Skripal agree to work for British intelligence? The short answer is that no one outside the classified records of SIS knows with certainty, and Skripal himself, in the various accounts of his statements, has not offered a single clear explanation. The longer answer is that 1995 was not 1975. By 1995, the Soviet Union had been dead for 4 years. The institutional loyalty that had given the GRU and the organizations that preceded it their moral authority, the belief that you served something larger, something that justified the secrecy and the discipline and the occasional brutality, had been structurally dismantled. The state that had commissioned his career had ceased to exist. What had replaced it was a chaotic oligarchic scramble that was very far, in spirit and practice, from the organized ideological project it had superseded. For men in Skripal's position, the collapse of the Soviet Union created a crisis of institutional identity that went much deeper than mere politics. He had built his entire adult life around service to a state structure that was now gone, replaced by something he had not been trained to serve and had no particular reason to respect. Whether this translated directly into a willingness to pass information to the British, whether he was motivated by financial considerations, by principled opposition to the direction Russia was taking, by personal disillusionment, or by some combination of all of these, cannot be stated with certainty. What can be stated is that he made the choice, and that the choice once made was not a small one. It was total, irrevocable, and carried risks that he understood better than almost anyone, given his own professional background in the world of intelligence and counterintelligence. The relationship that developed between Skripal and his MI6 handlers across the following years was productive by any measure. He passed information on GRU personnel operating undercover in European countries, on the organizational structures of GRU residencies, on the methods by which officers managed their cover identities and communicated with their headquarters. For SIS, still trying to reconstruct a coherent picture of Russian military intelligence's capabilities and methods in the post-Cold War environment, this material was of considerable analytical value. Networks that had operated undisturbed could now be identified. Officers whose cover had seemed secure could now be watched. Individual operations that had been running without opposition could now be countered. For Russia, when the full extent of what had been passed eventually became clear, the damage was significant. Significant enough to warrant, in the internal reckoning of Russian intelligence culture, the most serious response available. Not prosecution, not diplomatic protest. The specific kind of response reserved for those the system classifies as traitors beyond rehabilitation, beyond negotiation, beyond the ordinary remedies of law or politics. The kind of response that sends a message to everyone else in the system about what the price of defection actually is, denominated not in years of imprisonment but in something more permanent. But that reckoning was still in the future. Through the latter half of the 1990s and into the early years of the 2000s, Sergei Skripal lived a double life in the way that intelligence tradecraft requires, carefully, methodically, with constant attention to the gap between what the world saw and what was actually true. He went to work. He filed reports. He attended meetings. He socially navigated the professional world of the GRU with the surface presentation of a loyal and capable officer. And in the margins of that visible life, in the dead drops and the careful communications and the patient accumulation of information, he was doing something else entirely. The tension of that kind of existence does not diminish with practice. It accumulates. Every year that passes without exposure adds to the statistical improbability of continued safety while doing nothing to actually reduce the risk. The counterintelligence apparatus that Skripal was training himself to evade every working day was formidable, methodical, and patient in ways that his experience in the GRU gave him every reason to understand. He knew how these investigations worked. He knew what they looked for and how they found it. He had presumably organized his own approach to minimize vulnerability. But there is a fundamental limitation to all such efforts, and that limitation is that a human being cannot, over time, be perfectly invisible. Something eventually leaves a trace. The investigation that eventually exposed Sergei Skripal was not swift, and it was not dramatic in the way that exposures in espionage fiction tend to be. It did not culminate in a midnight raid or a dramatic confrontation at a border crossing. It ended, as so many counterintelligence investigations end, with an arrest that was the product of months of careful analytical work. The slow accumulation of discrepancies, anomalies, and circumstantial indicators that, taken individually, could each be rationalized away, but assembled together formed a pattern too complete to ignore. Russian counterintelligence, the FSB's second service, the directorate specifically chartered to find foreign intelligence penetrations of Russian security and defense institutions, had been working systematically through the 1990s and early 2000s to identify the sources that MI6 and other Western services had developed inside the Russian military and intelligence apparatus. The collapse of the Soviet Union had created a period of relative permeability, where the chaos of institutional transition, the sudden poverty of underpaid officers, and the general disorientation of the post-1991 world had made recruitment considerably easier for Western intelligence services than it had ever been during the structured, disciplined decades of the Cold War proper. Russian counterintelligence knew this. They established working groups specifically tasked with mapping the damage, identifying the lost intelligence, and tracing those losses back to individual sources. This is methodical work. It does not depend on any single dramatic discovery. It depends on correlation, on identifying operations that had been compromised and working backward through the pool of people who could have provided the relevant information. It depends on technical surveillance, on monitored communications, on the patient construction of timelines that eventually allow analysts to narrow a field of suspects to a manageable number. It depends on things like travel records and financial records and the careful documentation that intelligence bureaucracies cannot help producing even as they try to conceal their activities, because documentation is the mechanism by which bureaucracies function at all. Whether additional intelligence from outside Russia helped the FSB's counterintelligence efforts is a question that investigative accounts have addressed with varying degrees of confidence. Some analysts have suggested that the exposure of Robert Hanssen, the FBI agent arrested in 2001 for 22 years of espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union and Russia, may have provided peripheral leads. Hanssen was known to have compromised a number of individuals, and the investigation of his case generated information that had its own ripple effects. Others have pointed to the general vulnerability of the Western intelligence community to Russian penetration during that period and suggested that other, less publicly documented counterintelligence failures may have contributed to Skripal's identification. The full picture, if it exists anywhere in a coherent form, remains classified in the archives of both sides. What is established is that in late 2004, the FSB had built a sufficient case to act. Sergei Skripal was arrested in Moscow in December of that year. He was 53 years old. He had been running his double life for approximately 9 years, which by any measure represents a significant run of operational security, long enough that some of what he provided had presumably aged into relative irrelevance, but also long enough that the cumulative damage to Russian intelligence operations in Europe was substantial. The arrest was made quietly, as such arrests invariably are. There was no public announcement. He simply disappeared from his normal life, absorbed into the machinery of Russian state security with the efficiency that the FSB can apply when it chooses to. The interrogation that followed was managed by professionals. Skripal, by the accounts available, did not attempt to maintain his cover in any sustained way once it became clear that the counterintelligence case against him was solid. He confirmed his relationship with British intelligence and provided information about the nature and duration of his work for SIS. What precisely he disclosed during this period, what additional damage followed from the interrogation itself, is not publicly known. Intelligence services on both sides have declined to discuss it, for the obvious reason that any detailed accounting of what was and was not compromised would itself constitute a significant intelligence disclosure. His trial was held in 2006, conducted in the manner that Russian law prescribes for cases involving state secrets, behind closed doors with restricted access, the proceedings shielded from public scrutiny by the formal legal architecture designed precisely for this purpose. He was convicted of high treason. The sentence was 13 years in a Russian penal colony. He was taken to serve it. The penal colony system in Russia is not a comfortable institution. It is designed to be austere, disciplined, and to make the passage of time feel like a punishment in itself. The particular facility where Skripal served his sentence was in a region sufficient distance from Moscow that visits were rare and the rhythms of daily life were organized around the prison's requirements rather than the prisoner's preferences. He kept his own counsel by the few available accounts, and he adapted. He was not a young man, but he was fit, he was experienced in the management of demanding environments, and he possessed the psychological resources of someone who had known for years that a day like this was a real possibility and had, in some private part of himself, prepared for it. His family remained in Russia. His wife Ludmila, who had known nothing of his intelligence work until the arrest made it unavoidable knowledge, navigated the impossible position of a loyal spouse whose loyalty had been constructed on foundations she hadn't known existed. His daughter Yulia, still in her mid-20s, faced the specific difficulty of being the child of a convicted traitor in a society where institutional associations have long consequences. His son Alexander, a few years older than Yulia, managed as best he could. The family had not chosen any of this. They had simply been existing in its orbit. Russians who know the system well have noted that the 13-year sentence, while severe, was not, by the standards of what Russian courts can impose in treason cases, the maximum that could have been demanded. There are calibrations in these sentences that insiders can read, signals embedded in the numbers about how the state views the severity of the case and, sometimes, about what possibilities might exist for future negotiation. The intelligence community on the western side was watching. They had their own assessment of Skripal's situation, their own interest in his eventual outcome, and their own awareness that the tradition of spy swaps, of exchanging intelligence officers between adversary states, was a practice as old as the Cold War itself and had not become obsolete with the Cold War's formal end. The swap, when it came, surprised no one inside the relevant communities. What surprised people was its scale, its speed, and the remarkable theater of its execution. The event that made a swap both possible and politically attractive was the FBI's dismantling, between 2008 and 2010, of deep covert network of Russian sleeper agents operating inside the United States. A group of men and women who had lived embedded in American civilian life for years, some for decades, carrying false identities, fake biographies, fictional histories constructed with meticulous care by the SVR's Illegals Directorate. There were 10 of them, arrested across multiple states in coordinated operations in late June of 2010 under the codename Operation Ghost Stories. Their names, or rather their cover names, appeared in the newspapers. The real identities behind those cover names were the product of years of FBI investigation. The most publicly recognized of the 10 was Anna Chapman, a young woman who had been operating in New York financial circles under a legend that combined genuine personal history with carefully managed adjustments to the parts that needed obscuring. She had red hair and a public social media presence and a facility for the kind of social navigation that makes a spy effective, and she became the face of the story in the press coverage that followed her arrest, in part because she was genuinely photogenic and in part because the press found it convenient to have a single figure around whom to organize a complex story. But the more significant aspects of the Ghost Stories network were its less visible members. Individuals who had spent years building genuinely deep cover in American professional and social circles, whose compromises were strategic rather than operational, whose value to Moscow was the slow accumulation of access and influence rather than the immediate passing of classified documents. Several of them had been in place long enough that their cover identities had taken on a genuine biographical weight, complete with marriages, children, professional credentials, and the kind of social networks that cannot be manufactured overnight. The network's compromise was a significant setback for Russian intelligence. The SVR would spend years assessing the damage, identifying which operations had been burned, determining what the FBI had learned from the network's communications. The political pressure to resolve the situation quickly, to remove the 10 from American custody before extended proceedings could generate additional disclosures, was considerable. The Russian side wanted them back. The American and British sides wanted something in return. The mechanics of what followed were managed through intermediaries at a speed that suggested prior preparation, as though the broad outlines of an exchange had been discussed before the final arrests were made, a detail that has been noted in retrospective accounts of the event. On July 9, 2010, 2 aircraft met on the tarmac at Vienna International Airport, a location chosen with the particular kind of Cold War symbolism that intelligence officers appreciate, since Vienna had been one of the great neutral capitals of espionage throughout the 20th century. The Russian aircraft carried the 10 illegals, now formally released from American custody and being returned to Moscow. The Western aircraft carried 4 people who had been held in Russian custody on espionage-related charges. Igor Sutyagin, a Russian arms control researcher who had been convicted of passing information to a British company subsequently assessed to have intelligence connections. Gennady Vasilenko, a former KGB officer who had worked with the CIA. Alexander Zaporotsky, a former SVR officer, and Sergei Skripal. The 4 walked across the tarmac at Vienna. Sergei Skripal, 59 years old, his hair considerably grayer than it had been in 2004, descended from the Russian aircraft and moved toward the waiting car that would take him toward his new life. He had served approximately 6 years of his 13-year sentence. He had survived the penal colony. He had crossed the tarmac at Vienna Airport, which is a very specific thing to be able to say, and he knew better than anyone what it meant and what it cost and what it carried with it. He was taken initially for debriefing. The accumulated knowledge of 6 years of observation of the Russian intelligence system, what had changed, what had been reorganized, who had risen and who had fallen, what new methods and priorities had emerged, was information that SIS wanted to extract carefully and thoroughly while it was still fresh. This process takes time and does not happen in a single meeting. It happened over weeks and months, in locations that were not made public, with the methodical care that professional intelligence work demands. And after that process was sufficiently complete, Sergei Skripal was given a house, a British pension, and a new life in one of the quietest and most beautiful corners of England. Salisbury is the kind of English city that earns its reputation for beauty without appearing to try particularly hard. It sits in the valley of the River Avon in the county of Wiltshire, surrounded by chalk downland that rolls away in every direction toward horizons that feel both close and spacious at once. The particular trick of chalk country that gives the landscape its distinctive quality of openness beneath a wide sky. The city center is compact and medieval in its bones, a web of narrow streets and covered market rows that preserve the footprint of the settlement that grew up around the cathedral in the 13th century. When the bishop of the diocese moved his seat from the windswept hilltop of Old Sarum to the more comfortable valley location, and erected there one of the greatest Gothic cathedrals in England. The cathedral dominates Salisbury in the way that truly great pieces of architecture dominate cities, not by overwhelming everything around it but by providing a constant, orienting reference, a vertical anchor around which the horizontal city organizes itself. The spire is the tallest in England, 123 meters of medieval masonry tapering to a point that has been visible across the Wiltshire plain for over 700 years, weathering storms and wars and the slow geological patience of time. Inside, the cathedral holds one of the 4 surviving copies of the Magna Carta, sealed in 1215, a document whose survival in this small county city is either a remarkable historical accident or the kind of thing that, in retrospect, seems entirely fitting. Salisbury is that kind of place, old enough, settled enough, significant enough in an understated way that it wears its history comfortably, without the defensive self-consciousness of places that have to explain to visitors why they should care. The broader region amplifies this sense of layered time. Stonehenge sits 8 miles to the north on the open plain above the valley, its standing stones as enigmatic and as stubbornly present as they have been for the 4,000 years or so since they were put there by people whose reasons we still cannot fully reconstruct. The Wiltshire countryside is dense with prehistoric monuments, burial mounds, ancient pathways, the accumulated geography of human habitation going back beyond the reach of written record. For Sergei Skripal, coming from the Baltic exclave of Kaliningrad, a city whose history had been systematically erased and replaced, there must have been something almost incomprehensible about a landscape where the past is not only visible but continuous, where a walk on the chalk downlands takes you across ground that people have been crossing for millennia without interruption. He arrived in Salisbury sometime following the debriefing period in 2010, and he settled into a house on Christy Miller Road, a quiet residential street in the northern part of the city, an ordinary street of brick houses with small front gardens, the kind of street that exists in every English city and conveys, through every architectural detail, the particular English virtue of getting on with things without making a fuss. The house at number 47 became his. He planted the garden. He acquired guinea pigs, which he reportedly kept in a hutch in the back garden, tending to them with the matter-of-fact affection of an older man who has found pleasure in small, manageable things. He had a cat. He learned the rhythms of the neighborhood, the routines of the street, the particular texture of English suburban life that is at once more guarded and more neighborly than it immediately appears. His wife Ludmilla had come with him initially, but her health had been difficult, and she died in 2012, 2 years after their arrival in Salisbury. She had lived long enough to see him safe, to see him in the house with the garden in the English city, but not long enough to see what that safety ultimately proved to be worth. Her death left Sergei alone in the house with the guinea pigs and the garden and the gradually accumulating routines of retirement in a foreign country. He spoke English adequately, with a persistent Russian accent that made conversations with strangers a matter of some effort. He had a small circle of contacts, some local, some connected through the intelligence world that had been the organizing fact of his adult life. Pablo Miller, his former MI6 handler, lived in Salisbury. This is a detail that drew attention after the poisoning, not because it was suspicious in itself, but because it concentrated in one small English city an unusual density of connections to the British intelligence world. Whether Miller's presence was coincidence or by design, whether the intelligence services had arranged for handler and former agent to share a postcode as a matter of convenience and continued access, has not been officially explained. The two men reportedly had social contact in Salisbury, as neighbors in a small city sometimes do. They moved in overlapping civilian circles where no one who did not already know would have recognized what the relationship between them represented. Skripal also had a connection to Christopher Steele, the former MI6 officer whose research firm Orbis Business Intelligence had produced the dossier on Russian influence in the 2016 American presidential election. This was not a direct operational relationship. Steele and Skripal were not running active intelligence together, but it was another thread connecting the quiet residential streets of Salisbury to the wider world of post-Cold War intelligence, where retired officers, private intelligence consultants, and former assets sometimes find themselves in proximity through the networks that the intelligence world creates and never quite dissolves. Skripal's son Alexander visited him in Salisbury, though he spent most of his life in Russia. In 2017, Alexander Skripal died in St. Petersburg at the age of 43. The official cause of death was listed as liver failure. The timing of it, coming roughly a year before the attack on his father, prompted speculation in some quarters, though no evidence has emerged to confirm that Alexander's death was anything other than what the Russian authorities said it was. The loss hit Sergei hard. By accounts from people who knew him, the death of his son changed something in him, deepened a grief that the quiet life in Salisbury had been managing but not resolving. He had already lost his wife. Now his son. The people he had built his life around were leaving it one by one. What had Salisbury given him? A degree of safety, clearly, or what had appeared to be safety, which is perhaps the more important point. After the spy swap, the informal convention of the intelligence community held that exchanged officers were, if not fully protected, then at least removed from the active targeting calculus of their former employers. They had been formally traded, their status acknowledged, their futures regulated by the same set of norms and tacit agreements that had made the swap possible in the first place. To target someone who had been included in a formal exchange was to violate norms that served both sides, because both sides sometimes needed those norms to protect their own people. Skripal had reason to believe, not certainty but reason, that his years in Salisbury were years in which the machinery of Russian revenge had been suspended, if not permanently then at least for practical purposes. He had a car. He drove to the local supermarket. He went to the pub. He attended the local Russian Orthodox church on occasions. He had contact with the Russian community in Britain to a degree that some of his neighbors found surprising in retrospect, given what they later learned about who he had been. He was generous with his time. An acquaintance was quoted after the poisoning, describing him as the kind of man who would help you with anything, who turned up with tools if you needed a repair and who asked for nothing in return. The characteristics of someone who has decided that the life available to him deserves to be lived fully, without reserve, because he has arrived at an age and a situation where he understands what full living costs and is not prepared to waste it. Yulia visited regularly. She lived in Moscow, working in what was described as a human resources role for a technology company, and she maintained her Russian life with the pragmatic independence of a young woman who had grown up in the shadow of her father's situation and had found a way to navigate both worlds. Visiting him in England, returning to her life in Russia, a commuter between two places that were more different from each other than the flight time between them suggested. She had friends in Moscow and she had her father in Salisbury, and she moved between these two coordinates of her life with what appeared to observers to be relative ease. On the 1st of March 2018, Yulia Skripal flew from Moscow to London Heathrow. She had been planning the visit for some time. She brought a bottle of perfume as a gift, by later accounts, a detail that would acquire a grim relevance as the full picture of what happened in Salisbury during those days became clear. She arrived at Christie Miller Road and she and her father settled into the rhythms of a family visit. Meals at home, outings around the city, the kind of unhurried time together that adult children and aging parents find in the spaces between the ordinary demands of their separate lives. On the morning of Sunday, March 4th, they fed the ducks at the Queen Elizabeth Gardens. They had lunch at Zitsy Restaurant. They had a drink at the Mill Pub on the Avon. It was an unremarkable afternoon, indistinguishable from dozens of similar afternoons in dozens of similar cathedral cities across England. The city went about its weekend. The cathedral spire stood against the pewter sky. The pigeons walked along the edges of the maltings. And by the time Freya Church found them on the bench, the most ordinary Sunday in the world had become something else entirely. Vladimir Putin served as a KGB foreign intelligence officer for 16 years before the Soviet Union dissolved around the institution he had given his adult career to, leaving him, in his own later words, feeling like a man who had lost his country. He had served in Dresden, East Germany, during what turned out to be the final years of the Cold War, a relatively modest posting, not the prestigious foreign capitals like London or Washington that the most celebrated officers of the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Service occupied. When the crowds came to the Dresden KGB building in the revolutionary weeks of late 1989, and when Moscow did not respond to his calls for instruction, he burned documents and stood outside and understood, with the particular clarity of a small crisis, something about the nature of the system he had served and what it was worth when tested. He left the KGB in 1991. He entered politics. He rose with a speed that surprised almost everyone who observed it, until by 1999 he was the acting president of the Russian Federation. The institution he had served, and from which he had come, was never far from the center of his understanding of power. The KGB had been dissolved and reconstituted as a set of successor agencies, the FSB for domestic security and counterintelligence, the SVR for foreign intelligence, the FSO for protective functions, but the culture, the personnel, the institutional habits and values had not dissolved with the reorganization. They had been transplanted wholesale into the new structures, carrying with them the particular worldview that decades of Soviet state security work had produced. A vision of the world organized around threat and loyalty, around the perpetual hostility of foreign powers, around the fundamental importance of control and the fundamental danger of independent action. Putin had been formed by that culture. He had internalized it in the specific way that extended professional immersion in a closed institutional world shapes the people who spend their formative years inside it. His presidency, which in practice has continued with interruptions and reconfigurations from 1999 to the present, has been characterized by a systematic process of rebuilding Russian state power along lines that the intelligence and security world recognizes: centralized authority, elimination of independent checks, the rewarding of loyalty and the punishment of defection. The word that appears most consistently in analyses of his approach to governance is Siloviki, the power people, the men and women who rose through the security services and military structures and who formed the inner ring of his ruling coalition. For 18 years after 1991, Western governments cultivated a studied ambiguity about what Russia under Putin actually was and what it intended. That ambiguity became progressively harder to maintain. Central to the worldview that Putin both inherited and actively reinforced is a particular attitude toward betrayal. The Russian security services, in their Soviet and post-Soviet forms, have always maintained a doctrine regarding the treatment of those who defect to or collaborate with foreign intelligence services. The doctrine can be understood through a statement that Putin himself made publicly in 2010, the same year as the spy swap, a statement regarding traitors and the price of their choices. "Traitors will kick the bucket," Putin said. "Whatever they got for their treason, they will choke on it." He said this in a context that included a reference to Skripal by name, noting that he considered his case closed and that he had no particular interest in him. The contrast between that public dismissal and what his intelligence services were apparently already beginning to plan speaks for itself. The GRU, the Military Intelligence Directorate, has been a constant presence throughout the Putin era, but its profile and its relationship to political power have shifted considerably over the decades. It suffered budgetary and institutional setbacks in the 1990s and the early years of Putin's presidency, periods when the FSB dominated the security community's relationship with the Kremlin. But by the 2010s, the GRU was reasserting itself, conducting operations that demonstrated both ambition and a particular willingness to accept risk at a level that suggested strong political backing. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 involved GRU Special Operations Units, the little green men whose identity the Russian government denied before eventually acknowledging, in operations that ran directly from Moscow without the kind of institutional hesitation that might have characterized an earlier period. The GRU unit that would become central to the Salisbury story is known in open-source intelligence and investigative reporting circles as Unit 29155. This unit, whose formal designation in official Russian military structures is a matter of security classification, operates as what might best be described as a Special Missions Directorate, a group of officers and operatives chartered for extraordinarily sensitive work outside ordinary military or intelligence channels. The unit's activities, as reconstructed by investigative journalists at Bellingcat, The Insider, and other outlets using open-source methods over the years following the Salisbury attack, include a pattern of operations in multiple European countries involving the targeting of individuals assessed to be Russian intelligence priorities. Not all of these operations involved assassination. Some involved intimidation, destabilization, the support of political disruption in target countries. But some did involve direct physical action against specific human targets. The doctrine underlying these operations is sometimes called the doctrine of extraterritorial enforcement, though that is a bureaucratic description for something with a much starker human reality. What it means, in the language the security culture actually uses, is that the Russian state regards the physical location of a target as irrelevant to whether that target can be reached. The crossing of an international border, the acquisition of a different passport, the relocation to a country whose government has explicitly guaranteed your safety, none of these things are, in this doctrine, reliable protections. They are obstacles that require more planning and more resources to overcome, but they are obstacles, not barriers. The state that holds a grievance is patient enough and capable enough to eventually eliminate the practical distance between its intent and its execution. This doctrine has a history. In 1978, Georgy Markov, a Bulgarian dissident writer living in London, was killed on Waterloo Bridge with a ricin pellet injected by a modified umbrella. An operation so technically baroque and so brazen, conducted on the streets of central London in broad daylight, that it remains one of the most discussed case studies in the literature of political assassinations. The operation was Bulgarian state security, but it ran with KGB support. It was intended to send a message not only to Markov but to everyone else who had chosen to continue working against the Soviet bloc from the safety of the West. The message was direct. Safety is a word, not a guarantee. In 2006, Alexander Litvinenko died in a London hospital from polonium-210 poisoning, a radioactive element so rare that its presence in Litvinenko's body effectively served as a signature, pointing without ambiguity toward the only state capable of producing it in the relevant quantities. Litvinenko had been a former FSB officer who had publicly accused the organization of criminal activities and had been working with the Spanish intelligence service and with British authorities on organized crime investigations involving Russian networks. A British public inquiry opened in 2014 and reported in 2016 concluded that his killing was probably approved by Putin personally and by the then FSB director Nikolai Patrushev. Two FSB officers, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, were identified as his killers. They remained in Russia beyond extradition, treated not as fugitives but as figures of some standing. The Litvinenko case contained within it, explicitly, the lesson that was intended to be derived from it. Not merely that the FSB could operate in London, but that the British government's response, however strong in rhetoric, would not produce any action that actually threatened the people who ordered or conducted the operation. The two officers were not extradited. There were diplomatic consequences. Ambassadors recalled briefly, relations cooling, but the arc of UK-Russia relations bent back toward a kind of calculated normality within a few years. What Russia's security doctrines noted from this outcome was something about the practical limits of Western response to state-sponsored assassination on foreign territory. What followed from that notation was the assumption, which Salisbury would test, that the limits remained where they were. The specific decision to target Sergei Skripal appears to have been made in the period between 2012 and 2016, though the exact timeline of planning and authorization is not publicly known. What is known is that the planning was extensive, the preparation was detailed, and the choice of method was deliberate in ways that went beyond mere lethality. The use of a Novichok agent was not the most expedient way to kill a retired intelligence officer living in a small English city. A simpler method could have been chosen, if the only objective had been the man's death. The choice of Novichok, a compound whose origins are so specifically Russian that its presence functions as a national signature, suggests that the objective was not exclusively Skripals elimination, but also the demonstration that Russia could and would act, even with a weapon that left no room for plausible deniability, and that the consequences would not prove prohibitive. It was a message written in chemistry and addressed to every former Russian intelligence officer living in the West, every Russian dissident who had made a life in London or Vilnius or Prague or Paris, every individual who had at some point provided information to Western services and who was now living on the assumption that their contribution to the past could be separated from their safety in the present. The message was, the accounting never closes. The ledger stays open. And when the state decides to collect, it will collect in a way that cannot be misread. There is a word in the Russian language that translates approximately as combat poison substance or battle chemical agent, and it belongs to a specialized technical vocabulary developed by Soviet military chemists during the decades of the Cold War, when the development of chemical weapons was pursued with the same industrialized ambition that characterized the parallel programs in nuclear and biological warfare. The Soviet chemical weapons program was enormous in scale, secretive in operation, and remarkable in its achievements, if remarkable can be detached from the moral freight it carries when applied to weapons designed for mass killing. By the time the Soviet Union dissolved, it had produced and stockpiled quantities of chemical agents that exceeded anything in any other country's arsenal. The 1990 Chemical Weapons Convention, ratified by Russia in 1997, obligated the destruction of these stockpiles. What it could not as easily reach was the knowledge, the formulae, the synthesis routes, the production expertise that had accumulated in the heads and files of the scientists who had done the work. The program that produced Novichok began in the late 1960s under a Soviet government directive that assessed the existing classes of nerve agents, the G agents like sarin and tabun, the V agents like VX, as potentially compromised. The calculation was strategic. If Western intelligence had sufficient knowledge of these compounds, their antidotes and protective equipment could be developed to a standard that would neutralize much of their battlefield effectiveness. The directive that set in motion what became known as Project Foliant called for the development of entirely new classes of chemical agents, compounds that Western science had not characterized, against which protective equipment had not been optimized, and for which antidote protocols might be ineffective or absent. The goal was to build poisons that killed people who did not know they were being poisoned and that could not be identified or countered by an adversary who had no prior knowledge they existed. What emerged from Project Foliant over the following 2 decades was a group of compounds that Soviet scientists eventually designated Novichok, a Russian word meaning newcomer, along with related agents in a broader class that researchers sometimes call the 4th-generation chemical weapons. The specific compound used in Salisbury, identified by analysts who examined samples from the attack, was A234, one of the more potent members of this family. Its mechanism is the same as other organophosphate nerve agents, the inhibition of acetylcholinesterase, but its specific molecular structure gives it properties that make it distinctively dangerous. It binds to the target enzyme with a strength and persistence that makes the standard antidote regime significantly less effective than it would be with conventional nerve agents. It is capable of penetrating skin with minimal contact, meaning that external exposure to a surface contaminated with the substance is sufficient to cause a fatal or near-fatal dose without any dramatic event to announce that poisoning has occurred. The victim does not know they have been exposed until the effects are already progressing through them. The toxicity comparisons available in published literature, acknowledging that precise figures remain subject to considerable uncertainty given the secrecy surrounding this class of agents, suggest that Novichok at 234 is substantially more lethal than VX, which was itself the most potent nerve agent in the known Western arsenal at the time of its development in the 1950s. To describe these comparisons in practical terms, the quantity required to produce lethal effects in a human adult is measured in micrograms, a millionth of a gram. The substance that was applied to the door handle at 47 Christie Miller Road was sufficient, in the assessment of toxicologists who reviewed the case, to kill multiple people if distributed even slightly differently than it was. The fact that Sergei and Yulia Skripal survived was not a testament to the weapon's failure but to the extraordinary speed of the medical response and the fortunate circumstance that they did not receive the maximal possible dose through skin contact in the brief time they were touching the door. The scientist who brought Novichok to public knowledge was a man named Vil Mirzyanov. He had worked inside the Soviet and Russian chemical weapons program as an analytical chemist, and in 1992 he made the decision to disclose to a Russian journalist what had been developed under Project Foliant. He did this in the specific context of the signing of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Russian government's assertion that it was fully compliant with its obligations under the treaty. Mirzyanov's position was that it was fundamentally dishonest for Russia to sign a treaty committing to chemical weapons disarmament while concealing the existence of an entirely new class of agents that had been developed after the treaty's reference date. He went public, was arrested and charged with espionage, and was eventually released after pressure from Western governments and scientific organizations. He emigrated to the United States in 1995 and has continued to speak about the program since. His disclosures were the first time the name Novichok appeared in public scientific and journalistic literature, though the technical details he could provide were limited by the classification restrictions that governed what he had been allowed to know during his time in the program. He knew enough to establish that the compounds existed, that they represented a generational advance in nerve agent design, and that they had been developed specifically to circumvent the detection and protective capabilities of Western militaries. He could not provide the complete synthesis routes, which were held by scientists at a higher classification level than his own. The full technical specifications remained secret on the Russian side, and the programs that Western laboratories subsequently developed to characterize and understand the Novichok family had to work largely from indirect evidence and theoretical chemistry. When Porton-Down scientists examined the samples from Salisbury in March 2018 and identified A234, they were dealing with a compound they had studied extensively in purely theoretical terms, from Mirzyanov's disclosures, from published academic chemistry, from the monitoring work that international chemical weapons defense research requires, without ever having physically encountered it in the controlled environment of their own laboratory. The identification was made with high confidence by scientists who knew what they were looking at in a molecular sense, even though that knowledge had been acquired without the benefit of standing over the synthesized product in previous years. This is one of the reasons for the careful formulation used in official statements in the immediate aftermath. Confirmation that a Novichok compound had been used was possible. Attribution to a specific state actor was a political and analytical judgment that ran beyond what the chemistry alone could technically establish, even though it ran toward the same obvious conclusion. The production of Novichok agents at the level of purity found in Salisbury requires a significant chemical infrastructure. These are not molecules whose synthesis is simplified by the availability of precursor chemicals in ordinary industrial supply chains. The route to their production requires purpose-built facilities, specialized equipment, trained scientists with specific expertise, and the operational security infrastructure to conduct the work without generating the kind of evidence trail that monitoring regimes are designed to detect. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, the international body established under the Chemical Weapons Convention to verify compliance and investigate alleged uses, concluded in its assessments of the Salisbury case that the substance identified was of a high degree of purity consistent with a state-level production program. Russia denied everything. It denied that it had a Novichok program. It denied that it had produced the substance used in Salisbury. It denied that its nationals were responsible. It proposed an array of alternative explanations, that the UK itself had produced the agent, that other parties with access to Soviet-era research had manufactured it, that the entire event was a provocation staged by British intelligence to damage Russia's international reputation ahead of the World Cup that Russia was due to host in the summer of 2018. These denials were delivered through official channels, through the Russian Foreign Ministry, through ambassadors presenting formal notes, through the Russian representative at the United Nations Security Council vetoing motions that would have authorized an international investigation. The pattern of explanation was as familiar as it was transparent. The projection of implausibility onto each specific assertion while the overall picture assembled itself without ambiguity. What made Novichok the chosen instrument in Salisbury rather than something simpler and less traceable is a question that intelligence analysts and policy experts have discussed extensively since the attack. A firearm, a car accident, a fall from a height in a convenient location. The repertoire of methods available to a state security service is not limited to exotic chemistry. The choice of a Novichok compound was a choice that ensured everyone who understood the relevant technical background would know exactly who had ordered the operation, even as official channels denied any knowledge or involvement. Some analysts frame this as a deliberate form of communication, a method chosen not despite its traceability but because of it, designed to serve as a self-identifying signal to every potential target in the world that what had happened to Skripal was not an isolated incident but an expression of a consistent policy, operating across national borders, operating through methods the target state cannot easily defend against, operating with a confidence rooted in the assessment that consequences would remain, as they had remained after Litvinenko, within manageable limits. Somewhere in the months before the attack, 2 men sat in rooms in Moscow and received a briefing on Sergei Skripal. Everything that mattered would already have been gathered: the address on Christie Miller Road, the routines, the regular movements, the layout of the neighborhood, the distance from Salisbury city center, the transport connections to London and to Heathrow, the proximity of Porton Down and what that proximity would mean for the post-attack investigation. The planners who assembled this material were professionals in the full sense of the word. They understood their trade. They had assessed the target, the environment, the method, the exfiltration route, and the timelines with the care that an operation of this kind demands. They had selected the 2 men who would carry it out. They had provided them with the substance, the delivery mechanism, and the cover identities that would move them through the United Kingdom's border infrastructure without triggering any of the normal response that men traveling for the purpose they were actually traveling for would inevitably produce. The 2 men entered the United Kingdom using Russian passports in the names Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Basharov. These were not their real names. They were legends, cover identities constructed with the specific tools that a state intelligence service can deploy. Genuine-looking documentation, travel histories designed to build biographical plausibility, occupational backgrounds that explain the purpose of the visit without generating scrutiny. The passports were, in the assessment of British investigators who examined them afterward, of high quality, the product of professional document production rather than commercial forgery. But like all legends, they were constructions, and constructions contain seams that thorough investigation can eventually find. They arrived at London Heathrow Airport on the afternoon of March 2, 2018, on an Aeroflot flight from Moscow, flight SU-2588. The crossing of the border was untroubled. Their passports were checked, their faces were scanned, and the machinery of British border management let them through without incident, logging their entry in the records that would later be retrieved and assembled into a timeline. Border crossings at Heathrow see approximately 200,000 passengers every day. The immigration infrastructure processes this volume through a combination of automated and manual screening, designed to identify known threats, while moving the general population of travelers through at a speed that the world's busiest airports require. 2 Russian men with clean passports, plausible cover stories, and the careful presentation of people who have been trained in exactly this kind of scenario were not, in the ambient flow of a Friday afternoon terminal, immediately distinguishable from the thousands of legitimate travelers around them. They took the Heathrow Express into Paddington. They checked into the City Stay Hotel in Bow, in the East End of London, a budget business hotel, the kind of establishment that serves the category of traveler who needs a clean room, a working shower, and a bed without requiring anything more, and whose management and clientele create the kind of anonymous atmosphere that is professionally useful when you are in a city to conduct an operation. The hotel would later produce CCTV footage that became a cornerstone of the investigation. The cameras in the corridors and the lobby had captured their faces with the patient neutrality of electronic recording. No emotion, no inference, just light and time and the faces of 2 men who had planned their visit with extraordinary care and had not planned quite enough for the footage they were leaving behind. The following day, March 3rd, they traveled to Salisbury. This was a reconnaissance visit, the first of 2 trips to the city. They took the train from London Waterloo, changing at a junction station, then walking from Salisbury train station into the city center. Their movements on this day were subsequently reconstructed using the CCTV network, which in a British city centre is both extensive and largely continuous. They walked into the area around Christy Miller Road. They observed the vicinity of Skripal's house. They assessed the environment, the sight lines, the foot traffic, the proximity of neighboring properties, the approach and departure routes. Professional reconnaissance involves confirming that what the planning documents say matches what the physical reality presents, and adjusting the operational plan where discrepancies exist. They confirmed what they needed to confirm. They returned to London that evening. They spent the night at the City Stay Hotel. The following morning, Sunday, March 4th, they returned to Salisbury. They were carrying a modified perfume bottle. The bottle had been constructed to carry and dispense a substance that was anything other than perfume, a delivery mechanism designed with precisely the same professionalism that characterized every other aspect of the operation. The bottle was of the type used for Nina Ricci's Premier Jour fragrance, a genuine commercial product whose bottle had been adapted, the nozzle modified to allow controlled application of the liquid inside. The appearance left sufficiently intact that a casual inspection would register it as what it purported to be. The substance inside was Novichok A234, in a concentration and formulation specifically prepared for this method of delivery. The application was made at approximately 11:58 in the morning, according to the reconstruction assembled from CCTV footage, forensic evidence, and mobile phone data analysis. Sergei Skripal and Yulia were not at home at that hour. They left the house later in the morning, which means the approach to the door was made while the house was unoccupied, reducing the risk of immediate detection. The two operatives approached the front door of 47 Christy Miller Road and applied the substance to the exterior door handle using the modified bottle. The application was made to the specific surface that the residents of the house would most certainly touch, the handle that you grasp to open a door. Every person who has ever lived in a house with a door has their hand on that handle at least twice a day. The choice of this surface was not accidental. It was the most reliable point of contact available. After the application, they walked away from Christy Miller Road and made their way back toward the city center. They were moving with purpose but without visible urgency, the trained management of exit from an operational site that draws attention precisely when it looks hurried. They caught the train back toward London. They arrived at Heathrow. At approximately 9:28 in the evening, they boarded a return Aeroflot flight to Moscow. The entry records at Heathrow logged their departure. The border infrastructure let them go, as it had let them in, because there was as yet no reason to do otherwise. At roughly the time their flight was reaching cruising altitude over Eastern Europe, Sergei Skripal was at home with his daughter, preparing for an afternoon out. What the timeline suggests is that they touched the door handle when they returned from an earlier errand. The records indicate they went out to a local cemetery, where Sergei regularly visited the graves of his wife and son. They returned home. They opened the door. The substance on the exterior handle transferred to their hands with the efficiency of contact delivery. Sergei is assessed to have received more direct exposure than Yulia, based on the relative severity of their subsequent conditions, though both received a dose that would have proved fatal without rapid and expert medical intervention. They had no awareness of what had happened. The compound has no immediate sensory signature on skin contact, no smell, no burning sensation, no immediate pain. It is absorbed and then it waits and then it begins to work. They had lunch at Zitsy. They had a drink at the mill. They fed their bodies on a Sunday afternoon in the ordinary way of people who have no reason to suspect their nervous systems have been chemically compromised. The effects of Novichok A234 have a variable onset time that depends on the dose received, the route of exposure, and individual biological factors. The dose was sufficient, and the onset was late enough that the outing into the city center proceeded before the poisoning declared itself. And then they sat down on the bench at the maltings because they could no longer stay upright, and Freya Church found them, and the ordinary Sunday became the beginning of the most serious crisis in Anglo-Russian relations in a generation. The two men were on their way back to Moscow by the time the emergency services reached the bench. By the time the ambulances arrived at Salisbury District Hospital, their flight had been in the air for hours. By the time the first blood samples were drawn and dispatched to Porton Down, they were home. They had moved through Great Britain from arrival to departure in approximately 48 hours, leaving behind a contaminated door handle, a contaminated bench, contaminated surfaces in a restaurant and a pub, 2 people in intensive care, and a trail of digital and physical evidence that the investigators who assembled it would spend the following months and years turning into a case. The city of Salisbury woke on the morning of Monday, March 5th, to the news that something very serious had happened in its streets. The details were limited. A man and a woman, described at first simply as 2 adults, had been found seriously ill and were in intensive care. The nature of the illness was not yet public knowledge, and the language used in official statements was careful, calibrated for a situation where the full picture was still being assembled and the implications of disclosing it prematurely were enormous. But inside Whitehall, inside the intelligence services, the picture was assembling with a speed that matched the urgency of what it showed. And in the office of the Secretary General of NATO, and in Washington, and in the Allied capitals across Europe that would shortly receive calls from British counterparts, someone was picking up a telephone. The immediate medical response to the Salisbury poisoning unfolded in real time across a set of institutions that were, in different ways, entirely unprepared for what they were being asked to manage. Salisbury District Hospital was a well-run county hospital staffed by dedicated and capable professionals who dealt with the emergencies of their region with competence and care. It was not a facility that had been designed, equipped, or staffed with nerve agent management as a core operational scenario. The fact that it managed not to lose either of the Skripals in the critical first hours was an extraordinary achievement by its intensive care staff, working under conditions of radical uncertainty about the substance they were countering and the dosage they were dealing with. The hours after the Skripal submission were a controlled crisis. The attending physicians rapidly identified the organophosphate presentation. The symptom cluster was consistent enough that even without the specific identification of the compound, the broad treatment approach could be initiated. Atropine was administered, the standard competitive antagonist that blocks the flood of acetylcholine signals at muscular and glandular receptors. The challenge with Novichok A234, as toxicologists would later explain in clinical accounts of the case, is that the compound's binding to acetylcholinesterase is exceptionally strong, more resistant to reversal by pralidoxime, the reactivating agent, than conventional organophosphate agents would be. This meant that the antidote regime standard for pesticide poisonings or even some conventional nerve agents was not straightforwardly applicable, and doctors were making adjustments based on clinical response in real time, without the benefit of prior protocols for the specific compound they were addressing. Both Sergei and Yulia were placed in medically induced comas. This is not a passive intervention. It is an intensive, managed process that requires continuous monitoring, ventilatory support, careful titration of sedation, and the constant presence of staff capable of responding to the cardiac and respiratory complications that organophosphate poisoning can produce without warning. The intensive care unit at Salisbury District Hospital, which had not been expecting a nerve agent emergency on a quiet Sunday in early March, was suddenly managing 2 critical patients who required the kind of continuous, expert, resource-intensive care that would have challenged a specialized toxicology unit, let alone a county hospital's general ICU. Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey was among the first police officers who had responded to the initial call at the Maltings. He had also attended the house on Christie Miller Road as part of the standard response to a medical emergency, going to the address connected to the victims to check for additional casualties, secure relevant evidence, and establish the basic facts of the situation. He had moved through the house. He had touched surfaces. He had conducted a professional assessment of a domestic space without any reason to treat that space as a live chemical weapons site, because nobody had yet established that it was one. The door handle that the 2 GRU operatives had treated that morning was one of the things he came into contact with in the course of his professional duties. In the days following March 4th, Bailey became severely ill. His symptoms followed the same organophosphate pattern that the Skripals had displayed: the constriction, the sweating, the neurological disruption. He was admitted to the same hospital and treated with the same aggressive antidote regime. He survived, eventually, after weeks in intensive care, but the path back from the acute phase of Novichok poisoning is not a direct one. The compound's effects on the nervous system do not simply reverse with treatment. The neurological damage accumulates. The recovery is slow, nonlinear, and incomplete in ways that are difficult to predict from the outside and deeply difficult to live through from the inside. Bailey would later describe the experience publicly in terms that made clear how profoundly it had changed him, not only physically but in his relationship to the career he had given 25 years of his life to, and in his sense of who he was and what he was capable of. The contamination picture that emerged as the investigation expanded in the days after the attack was alarming in its breadth. Specialist teams from the Emergency Response Division and from the military's CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear response units were deployed to Salisbury with the full protective equipment required for remediation work in a contaminated environment. They identified and cordoned off a series of locations across the city center where Sergei and Yulia were known or assessed to have been on March 4th, and where surface contamination with the agent was subsequently confirmed. Zitsy restaurant was closed and decontaminated. The Mill pub was closed and decontaminated. The Queen Elizabeth Gardens required assessment. The maltings area, including the bench itself, was sealed off. The house on Christie Miller Road became the center of the forensic operation. The door handle was the primary contamination point. The highest concentration of the agent was found there. Inside the house, lower but still significant levels of contamination were found in several locations, presumably from secondary transfer as the Skripals moved through the space after touching the front door. The guinea pigs and cat that Skripal kept were found dead in the house, casualties of the contamination that had spread through the environment in ways that small animals with different physiological parameters experienced differently than humans. This detail, among all the grim details of the case, attracted a particular kind of public attention in the UK, where the welfare of animals tends to produce emotional responses that sometimes outpace those generated by abstract threats to humans. For the residents of Salisbury, the arrival of people in full hazmat equipment, white protective suits, full-face respirators, sealed containers, in their city center was profoundly disorienting. The Maltings shopping area is the commercial heart of Salisbury's daily life. The restaurants and pubs that were closed and cordoned off were establishments that the city's residents used weekly, in some cases daily. The sight of white-suited decontamination teams working inside building enclosures sealed with plastic sheeting, under the arc lights required for night work, against the medieval backdrop of the cathedral and the ancient streetscape, generated a quality of unreality that those who were there described consistently in their subsequent accounts. This was England. This was a cathedral city on a Sunday afternoon. The apparatus unfolding in its streets belonged to a different order of events entirely. The families of the three most severely affected individuals, Sergei, Yulia, and Nick Bailey, were in their own versions of this crisis. Bailey's wife Sarah had been told by her husband, in the early days before his condition reached its most critical point, to burn the clothes she had been wearing when they were last together, because the precautionary advice that was being issued covered anyone who had been in close contact with first responders before the contamination was identified. This is the kind of instruction that locates a family inside a catastrophe of a type they have had no preparation for and no reference point to manage. Sarah Bailey would later speak publicly about those weeks in the hospital, about the uncertainty of the prognosis, about not knowing whether the man in the ICU bed was going to come home. Yulia Skripal had not been formally contactable by the Russian government in the hospital. She was a Russian citizen in a British hospital, her status a delicate subject given who her father was and what had been done to them. The Russian embassy in London made multiple requests for consular access. The British government's position, consistent with its overall handling of the situation, was that access would be dependent on Yulia's own wishes and could not be granted without her explicit consent. Until she was well enough to express a preference, the answer from the British side was measured. The Russian side interpreted this as obstruction and said so publicly. The British side noted that they were waiting for the patient to be in a position to communicate, which was simply true. The hospital staff who managed the three critical patients through those first weeks did so under conditions that extended well beyond the clinical. They were working in a facility that had become, without any preparation or warning, the front line of a geopolitical incident. Journalists waited outside. Intelligence officers were regular visitors, coordinating the evidence-gathering work with the medical management of the patients. Government ministers made calls. The weight of the situation was distributed across a staff that had signed on to treat the residents of Wiltshire in their medical emergencies, not to manage the intersection of an assassination attempt, a nerve agent emergency, and an international political crisis. Both Sergei and Yulia Skripal were eventually discharged from the hospital. Yulia was the first to recover sufficiently for discharge in approximately 5 weeks. Her recovery was the more rapid precisely because she had been exposed to a slightly lower dose by the forensic assessment. She made a public statement through the hospital, read by a police liaison officer, that was characteristically restrained, expressing her gratitude to the medical staff, her hope to return to normal life, and her determination not to speak further publicly until she chose to. The statement was her first words in the public domain since her collapse. It said nothing about who was responsible. It said nothing about Russia. It said exactly what she had decided to say, in exactly the way she had decided to say it, and in that careful precision it reflected something recognizable about the family character of the woman who had written it. Sergei's recovery took longer. He was in the induced coma for a greater portion of the critical period, and his overall exposure was assessed as heavier. But he too was eventually discharged, to a location that was not publicly disclosed, under arrangements that the British government declined to detail. The guinea pigs were dead. The house on Christie Miller Road was sealed indefinitely. The life he had built in Salisbury, the garden, the neighbors, the walks to the feeding spot by the river, was gone in a practical sense, even though he had survived the effort to end it. The investigators who assembled the picture of what had happened in Salisbury were drawn from multiple organizations, working under the counter-terrorism command of the Metropolitan Police, the specialist unit commonly called SO-15 that handles the most sensitive terrorism and national security investigations in the UK. The formal classification of the Salisbury attack as a matter for counter-terrorism command rather than for Wiltshire Police, which had jurisdiction over the county, reflected an immediate determination within the British government that this was not an ordinary crime requiring ordinary investigation. What had happened in Salisbury was going to take a different set of resources, a different set of tools, and a different level of institutional coordination than a county CID could provide. The investigation had 3 parallel strands running simultaneously from the earliest days. The forensic strand gathered physical evidence from the contaminated sites, analyzed substance samples, and built the toxicological picture that Porton Down was simultaneously constructing from its own analysis. The intelligence strand tried to identify what was already known about the operation, whether any signals intelligence, human intelligence, or prior surveillance had captured any indication that a Russian operation against Skripal was in preparation, and whether any of that prior material could now be used to accelerate the identification of the responsible parties. And the digital strand, which would prove to be among the most productive avenues, began the laborious and extensive process of reviewing CCTV footage from every relevant camera in Salisbury and the relevant transit corridors between the city and London. The United Kingdom's CCTV infrastructure is, by international standards, extraordinarily comprehensive. The country has more surveillance cameras per capita than almost any other democracy in the world, a legacy of security responses to IRA terrorism in the 1980s and 1990s that was progressively expanded and is now so deeply embedded in the physical environment of British cities that most residents move through it without conscious awareness. For investigators, this creates a specific capability: the ability to reconstruct individual movement trails through urban environments with a level of completeness that would be impossible in a country with less developed camera coverage. If 2 men entered Salisbury, moved through its streets, approached a house, and left again, there was a reasonable probability that multiple cameras had captured pieces of that movement, each providing a fragment that, assembled in sequence, would produce a coherent timeline. The assembly of the CCTV footage was painstaking work. It required identifying the relevant cameras, obtaining their footage, reviewing that footage frame by frame, identifying the individuals of interest across multiple systems running at different resolutions and different frame rates, and constructing a continuous record from a mosaic of disparate fragments. The faces that the investigation identified as its primary subjects, two men, captured first in footage from Salisbury on March 3rd and then again on March 4th, were cross-referenced against border records from Heathrow, against hotel records, against transport system cameras, against every secondary cache of imagery that could be identified and accessed. The timeline that emerged from this work was the evidentiary backbone of the entire case. The passport records for Petrov and Bashirov told their own story to investigators familiar with the specific tells of Russian intelligence documentation. The passport numbers fell in a sequential range that analysis suggested was inconsistent with genuine civilian registration. The particular sequences favored by the GRU's documentation section when manufacturing legends have identifiable patterns to those who know what to look for. The biographical details associated with the two passports, when cross-referenced against records that independently documented things like mobile phone registrations, hotel reservations, and travel bookings, showed the characteristic thinness of legends. Thin not in the superficial sense of looking fake to a casual observer, but in the deeper sense of lacking the kind of incidental biographical residue that a person genuinely living under a name accumulates over years. The accounts existed in official records. They had almost no footprint anywhere else. At Portondown, the scientific work ran in parallel with the investigative work. The facility had been operational since 1916 and had spent over a century developing analytic and defensive expertise in chemical, biological, and toxicological threats. Its scientists had the deepest knowledge anywhere in the UK of the class of agents into which Novichok falls, informed by decades of defensive research and, since Mirzanov's disclosures in the early 1990s, by the publicly available scientific literature on the Folian program. The analysis of the samples collected from the Skripals and from the contaminated surfaces in Salisbury produced, in the initial assessment, a high-confidence identification of A234. The word high confidence in the scientific context means something specific. It means the analytical methods produced a result consistent with only one possible identification and that multiple independent tests converged on the same conclusion. It does not mean certainty in the philosophical sense, because science cannot generally offer certainty, but in practical terms it meant that the scientists reporting to the government were as certain as scientific analysis allows them to be. The substance was a Novichok compound. It was of a purity consistent with sophisticated state-level production. It was not a commercial compound, not a laboratory test compound, not an environmental contaminant of any kind consistent with known industrial processes. It was a weapon made by a state and used on a specific target. The OPCW was brought in to provide independent verification. This was a decision made at the government level, partly to ensure that the evidentiary record would be internationally credible, to preempt the obvious Russian counter-assertion that British findings were politically motivated and scientifically unreliable. OPCW inspectors collected their own samples from the relevant sites and analyzed them at one of the organization's designated reference laboratories. Their findings concurred with Portondown's identification. The substance was a Novichok compound. The purity was extremely high. The OPCW's formal report was careful in its language about attribution. The organization's mandate is verification rather than prosecution, and attributing state responsibility for a chemical weapons attack goes beyond purely chemical analysis. But the technical findings made the direction of attribution inescapable to anyone reading them without a prior commitment to a contradictory conclusion. The intelligence agencies of Britain's closest partners contributed their own assessments to the picture. The Five Eyes community, the intelligence sharing arrangement that links the UK with the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, brought substantial analytical resources to bear on the attribution question. American intelligence, in particular, had developed its own extensive analysis of GRU operations and methods, and the pattern of the Salisbury attack was consistent with what those analyses documented about how Unit 29155 conducted operations. The signatures were recognizable. The use of a state security service with military intelligence cover, the specific operational approach of applying a substance to a surface at the target's home, the two-person team structure, the false passport legends of high quality but identifiable provenance, the rapid departure through Heathrow on commercial aviation. What the investigative picture revealed, once enough of it was assembled, was something beyond the specific incident in Salisbury. It revealed an organization operating with considerable confidence, in the assumption that its methods would not be definitively attributed even if the operation itself was eventually connected to Russia in general terms. This was the Litvinenko lesson internalized and formalized. The attack can be credibly attributed. The specific operational unit cannot be reached. The GRU's assessment, built on that precedent, appears to have been that A-234, used through a surface contamination method in a civilian environment, would produce the target's elimination through what would look initially like a mysterious illness, creating a period of ambiguity during which the operatives would be safely home and the specific evidential trail would be too fragmented to reconstruct. The assessment was wrong. The ambiguity period was measured not in weeks but in days. The CCTV coverage was more comprehensive than the planners had apparently accounted for. The digital footprint of the travel documents was more legible than anticipated to the analysts who examined it. The forensic evidence from the door handle was more precisely preserved than weather and time might reasonably have been expected to allow. And the investigative community that was brought to bear on the case had, in the years since Litvinenko, developed both the appetite and the institutional capability to push further into attribution than the Russian side had factored into its risk assessment. The operation had been prepared with extraordinary care in most respects. But the calculus about the investigation that would follow had been miscalculated, and that miscalculation would produce consequences that the planners demonstrably had not anticipated. On March 12, 2018, 8 days after the bench at the Maltings and 2 days after OPCW confirmation of the initial Portendown findings had been communicated to the government, Theresa May rose in the House of Commons to address Parliament. She had been Prime Minister for less than 2 years, a period that had been almost entirely dominated by the demands of managing Britain's departure from the European Union, a project so all-consuming that almost every other policy consideration had been subordinated to its requirements. The Salisbury attack arrived not as an additional complication but as a qualitatively different kind of challenge, a rupture in the basic norms of state behavior that demanded a response at a level the Brexit negotiations, however fraught, did not approach. Her statement was careful in the way that government statements in such situations always are, but underneath the parliamentary language was a clarity that left very little room for ambiguity. The substance used against Sergei and Yulia Skripal, she said, had been identified as a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia, known as Novichok. Based on that identification, the government had concluded that it was highly likely that Russia was responsible, and that this pointed either to direct action by the Russian state or to the possibility that Russia had lost control of this agent and allowed it to reach other parties. She was explicit that neither conclusion was acceptable, and that both amounted to an unlawful use of force by Russia against the United Kingdom. The framing of highly likely, rather than certain, drew some criticism from those who felt it understated the confidence of the government's assessment or provided Russia with an unnecessary argumentative opening. The government's defense of the formulation was that in public statements involving intelligence assessments, language is calibrated to what can be publicly stated and defended rather than to the totality of what the classified picture shows. The Portendown identification was certain of the compound. The attribution of responsibility to the Russian state was the product of combined technical, analytical, and intelligence assessments that the government regarded as conclusive but could not fully disclose without compromising the methods and sources that produced them. Highly likely was the public-facing calibration of a private certainty. She gave Russia a deadline to respond to a set of questions about the Novichok program and the attack. The Russian government's response, delivered by its ambassador and subsequently its foreign ministry, was a comprehensive denial that addressed each question by redirecting it or dismissing the premise. Russia had no Novichok program. Russia had no knowledge of any Russian nationals conducting operations in Salisbury. Russia demanded access to the investigation, to the OPCW samples, to Yulia Skripal, to the evidence. The demands were framed as the legitimate rights of a state whose citizens and property were being discussed, and they were delivered with the specific energy of a government that has decided to treat the entire matter as a fabrication advanced in bad faith by its adversary. Theresa May returned to the Commons a few days later to announce the British government's response. 23 Russian diplomats were declared persona non grata, and ordered to leave the United Kingdom within a week. This was the largest expulsion of Russian diplomatic personnel from Britain since 1971, when a similar mass expulsion had followed the defection of Oleg Lenin and the revelation of a Soviet intelligence network. The 23 expelled were assessed to be undeclared intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, the standard practice of embedding intelligence personnel within official embassy structures under the protection of diplomatic immunity. Removing 23 of them at once was a significant disruption to the Russian intelligence presence in London, though both sides understood that diplomatic expulsions are a recoverable setback. Officers are replaced over time, networks are rebuilt, and the disruption, while real, is not permanent. Russia retaliated with symmetrical expulsions. 23 British diplomats were declared persona non grata and required to leave Moscow. The British consulate in St. Petersburg was ordered to close. The pattern was familiar from Cold War playbooks and from the Litvinenko aftermath. The tit-for-tat expulsion sequence that allows both sides to register the conflict in formal diplomatic terms while managing its escalation within channels that preclude the most extreme outcomes. It was serious, significantly more serious than anything in the bilateral relationship for decades, but it was managed seriousness, with both sides maintaining the formal structures of diplomatic engagement even as the content of that engagement became openly hostile. The more significant response, and the one that demonstrated the extent to which the British government had coordinated its reaction across the alliance before announcing it, was the collective expulsion of Russian diplomats by allied and partner countries. Within days of the British announcement, 25 other countries announced their own expulsions, totaling more than 150 Russian diplomats expelled from Western capitals in a coordinated action that represented the largest single collective expulsion of Russian intelligence personnel in history. The United States expelled 60 individuals and ordered the closure of the Russian consulate in Seattle. Germany, France, Poland, the Czech Republic, and most other NATO members expelled one or more Russian officials. Australia, Canada, NATO headquarters itself, the response was both broad and, in terms of its coordination, remarkably coherent. The Russian government responded to this collective action with the specific contempt that its official communications tend to deploy when confronted with Western solidarity. The expulsions were described as an unfriendly and unwarranted act based on fabricated evidence. Russia would respond in kind, and did, implementing its own series of reciprocal expulsions from the affected countries. The diplomatic cost to Russia was real. The simultaneous reduction of its official intelligence presence in dozens of Western countries was a disruption to operations that would take years to fully repair. But the Russian government's public communications did not concede any point of substance, and the domestic Russian audience that those communications were primarily addressed to received a consistent narrative of Western aggression and Russian victimhood that bore no recognizable connection to the event that had produced the crisis. It was into this environment that Russian state television's RT network introduced one of the most remarkable pieces of public communication in the long history of Russian desinformation. In September 2018, RT Russia Today, the state-funded international broadcast network, aired an interview with the two men who had traveled to Salisbury in March. They appeared under their cover names, Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Basharov, and they sat before the cameras with a specific kind of managed composure and explained their visit to Salisbury. They had gone, they said, as tourists. They had wanted to see the famous cathedral. Salisbury, they noted with the careful enthusiasm of men who have been briefed on the talking points, has a cathedral with a 123-meter spire that is world-famous and which they had very much wanted to see. They had visited on March 3rd, intending to spend more time, but the snow, they mentioned the snow, unusual weather conditions that had affected travel that weekend, had prevented a full visit. They had returned the following day to see more of the cathedral, but the weather remained unhelpful, and they had returned to London before completing their intended sightseeing. The interview was conducted by Margarita Simonyan, RT's editor-in-chief, and its purpose was evident in every exchange. The two men appeared as private citizens who happened to share initials and travel dates with the individuals sought by British investigators, but who had entirely innocent reasons for being in Salisbury on those dates. The cathedral story was the thread, and it was pulled with as much conviction as the two men could manage, which was not quite enough. Their body language, the slightly too controlled posture, the answers that came a fraction too smoothly, the occasional flicker across the face that suggested a man working hard to maintain a story rather than a man simply recalling a pleasant holiday, was read by virtually every specialist analyst who reviewed the footage as demonstrating exactly the kind of trained composure that intelligence officers develop and that people on genuine tourist trips to cathedral towns do not typically require. The public response to the interview was, in the UK and internationally, largely one of incredulity edged with dark comedy. The 123-meter spire was invoked so frequently and with such apparent reverence by the two men that within days it had become a shorthand, in British media commentary and political satire, for the whole genre of implausible cover story. The interview became a cultural artifact of the information war that accompanied the physical attack. A piece of evidence not of innocence but of the specific kind of contempt that produces an explanation so thin it functions as a taunt. The two men who gave that interview on RT were not who they said they were. By the time they sat in front of the cameras in September 2018 and explained their cathedral tourism, a group of journalists, analysts, and open-source investigators had already spent months assembling a case that identified them with a precision that no amount of cover story could survive. The work that produced this identification was conducted outside official intelligence channels, using methods that are now associated with a specific new form of investigative journalism: the systematic exploitation of open-source information to produce intelligence-grade conclusions without access to classified data. The organization primarily responsible was Bellingcat, the investigative journalism collective founded by Elliot Higgins in 2014, which had established its credibility and methodology in earlier investigations, including the attribution of the MH17 aircraft shootdown over eastern Ukraine in 2014. Bellingcat's approach combines meticulous analysis of publicly available digital information, social media, satellite imagery, leaked databases, flight records, commercial data aggregators, government-facing public registries, with the kind of analytical rigor and documentation that allows conclusions to be independently verified by anyone with access to the same sources. Their model is deliberately transparent. Show your work, cite your sources, and let the findings stand or fall on the evidence rather than on institutional authority. Working in partnership with The Insider, an independent Russian investigative news outlet with access to Russian-language sources, and the specific database knowledge required to navigate the Russian bureaucratic information environment, Bellingcat began the identification of Petrov and Bashirov within weeks of their names entering the public domain following the British government's formal identification of the two suspects in September 2018. The approach was methodical, each step building on the previous one through cross-referencing between databases that, individually, seemed to offer only fragments but assembled together produced something comprehensive. The breakthrough came through Russian mobile phone records, passport issuance data, and the specific anomaly analysis that had been applied to the passport numbers. The passport in the name of Ruslan Bashirov had a number that fell in a range reserved, analysis suggested, for passports issued through a specific administrative route linked to the FSB's documentation service, the office that produces false documents for intelligence officers and operatives. The number sequence was not uniquely conclusive in isolation, but cross-referenced with the biographic thinness of the associated records and the specific travel pattern documented by British investigators, it pointed toward an individual whose real identity sat in a different record set entirely. The man traveling as Ruslan Bashirov was identified as Anatoly Vladimirovich Chepiga, a colonel in the GRU. He was 40 years old at the time of the Salisbury attack. He had served in the GRU Special Forces in operations including those connected to the war in Chechnya and subsequently, this detail would prove significant, in operations connected to Russian actions in Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. In 2014, Chepiga received, according to sources accessible through Russian government publication registries, the Hero of the Russian Federation, the highest state honor Russia can bestow. The specific circumstances of his award were classified, as they typically are for military intelligence officers receiving state honors, but the timing aligned precisely with the period of Russian military operations in Crimea and eastern Ukraine that the GRU ran under deniable cover. A GRU colonel awarded the Hero of the Russian Federation in 2014 was, in the reading of analysts familiar with Russian military honor practices, most likely being recognized for operational command in those specific theaters. The man traveling as Alexander Petrov was identified as Dr. Alexander Yevgenyevich Mishkin, also a GRU officer, but of a different operational background. Mishkin held a medical degree. He was a trained physician, which in the GRU context typically indicates assignment to a unit's support function, providing the medical expertise that special operations units require for casualty management and, in the case of chemical or biological exposures, for understanding the effects of the methods being deployed. His presence on an operation involving a nerve agent would make specific operational sense if his role included medical assessment of the dose, the delivery method, the expected timeline of effects, and the monitoring of whether the operation had achieved the intended physiological outcome. A doctor who understood what Novichok at 234 did to the nervous system, and who understood the dose parameters that corresponded to specific outcomes, was a particular asset in the planning and execution of this specific type of attack. Bellingcat published its identifications in September and October of 2018. The publications were met, in Russia, with denials of the usual form. The identifications were fabricated, the databases were faked. The entire investigation was a product of Western intelligence services laundering classified material through a convenient non-governmental front. This explanation had the advantage of requiring no specific factual engagement with the evidence presented, and it was delivered with the standard official confidence. But the identifications were replicated independently by multiple other outlets and verified against overlapping source sets. And the specific details, the hero of the Russian Federation Award, the passport issuance anomaly, the GRU unit affiliations, were not the kind of things that could be fabricated without state-level access to the falsification of multiple independent database systems simultaneously. A third figure emerged from the investigation in subsequent months. He was Denis Valentinovich Sergeyev, operating under the alias Sergei Fedotov, assessed to be a senior GRU officer in the chain of command above Chepiga and Mishkin, a coordinator rather than an operator, the presence whose role in the operation was organizational and supervisory rather than directly physical. Sergeyev/Fedotov had also traveled to the UK in the period surrounding the attack, his movements documented in the same border and hotel record systems that had captured the two primary operatives. His identification added a hierarchical layer to the picture. This was not a two-person improvisation but a structured operation with command and control running from Moscow through an officer-level chain to the operatives on the ground. The cumulative picture that emerged from Bellingcat's investigation was a GRU unit, Unit 29155, operating in the specific mode of an extraterritorial assassination program, staffed by decorated officers, authorized at high levels, and equipped with the state's most sensitive and destructive capabilities. The unit had not been publicly known before the Salisbury investigation generated the investigation that exposed it. Its existence was now a matter of public record, documented through open-source methods by a non-governmental organization working without official access, and the evidence base was robust enough that no serious intelligence analyst subsequently challenged the identifications, including, in the candid assessments offered privately rather than in official public statements, those in Western intelligence services who had access to the classified picture that confirmed the same conclusions. The British government formally charged Chepiga and Mishkin in absentia with conspiracy to murder attempt, and the use of a chemical weapon, charges that under English law can be laid against identified suspects, even when those suspects are beyond the reach of extradition. Russia does not extradite its own nationals, a constitutional provision that creates a specific form of impunity for state-sanctioned operators. The charges were filed and added to the public record. The two men remained in Moscow, promoted and honored and entirely beyond the reach of the judicial process that had documented their actions. For the families and survivors of the Salisbury attack, the identification of the men responsible was a moment of recognition rather than resolution. Nick Bailey, still dealing with the aftermath of his own poisoning, had known for months what the intelligence picture was pointing toward. Knowing the names and ranks of the men who had done it, having those names on the official record was something. It was the truth made public and documented, which is not a small thing, but it was not justice in the operative sense that criminal justice normally provides. The men named on the charges were having lunch somewhere in Moscow. They would continue to have lunch in Moscow. The fact that their names now appeared in charging documents in the UK had no practical effect on their freedom, their safety, or their career progression within the organization that had sent them to Salisbury. The investigation's work, however, extended beyond the two operatives. It had documented an organization. It had established a methodology. It had produced a replicable open-source investigative template that could be applied to future operations attributed to Unit 29155, and which subsequent investigations would apply with results that built a broader picture of the unit's European activities across years. Salisbury was not the unit's only operation. It was the one that generated enough public scrutiny to expose the unit entirely, and that exposure had its own kind of consequence: the disruption of cover identities, the compromise of operational methods, the requirement to reconfigure an anonymous apparatus that was now anything but. June 30th, 2018, fell on a Saturday. The summer had arrived in Wiltshire with the kind of generosity that English summers occasionally manage and that residents remember for years afterward. Long daylight hours, actual warmth, the gardens along Christie Miller Road full of flowers with nobody to tend them at number 47, which remained sealed and silent behind its police cordons. The decontamination work on shops and restaurants in the city center had been completed weeks earlier. The Maltings was open again. Zitsy was serving customers. The Mill Pub had cleared its outdoor tables back to the riverbank. The visible traces of March had been largely removed from the public environment, though the psychological traces remained in the way that traumatic events leave marks in collective memory that physical remediation cannot reach. For months had passed since the attack. The Skripals had survived. Nick Bailey had survived. The immediate crisis had generated its international diplomatic response, its rounds of expulsions, its formal attribution, its legal charges. The story had moved from the daily news cycle into the slower rhythm of ongoing development, parliamentary committee hearings, OPCW processes, the criminal investigation pursuing leads that generated periodic disclosures but no arrests. The residents of Salisbury were attempting, with the patient resilience that communities display after events they had no agency in choosing, to return to the ordinary business of their lives. On that Saturday evening in Amesbury, a small market town 8 miles north of Salisbury, sitting in the shadow of Stonehenge on the edge of the chalk plain, a 47-year-old woman named Dawn Sturgis was given a gift by her partner. Charlie Rowley had found a small perfume box, and inside it was a bottle of what appeared to be a Nina Ricci fragrance. He presented it to Dawn. She was touched. She sprayed some of it on her wrists. The details of how Charlie Rowley came to have the bottle have been reconstructed from his own account, given during the period of his recovery, and from the investigation that followed. He had found it in a location that, the investigators would establish, connected directly to what Petrov and Bashirov had done on March 4th. The modified Nina Ricci Premier Jour bottle, the one used to carry and apply the Novichok to Skripal's door handle, had not been recovered in the immediate investigation. The operatives had carried it with them after the application. They had then disposed of it before leaving for the airport, either discarding it in a bin or setting it down somewhere from which it could be taken. The bottle's contents were not exhausted by the application to the door handle. A significant quantity of liquid remained inside. The method of delivery had used a small portion of what the bottle carried. Rowley found the bottle. He may have found the box separately and the bottle separately. He does not remember all of the details clearly, a consequence of what was about to happen to him. He believed it was an unopened perfume gift set. He wrapped it or presented it. The precise circumstances he described are not entirely consistent across accounts, which is a detail that toxicologists would note does not undermine their reliability, since the acute phase of Novichok poisoning attacks memory along with everything else. He gave it to Dawn. She applied it to her wrists. She rubbed it in the way that you apply perfume when you are pleased to be wearing it and not yet aware that anything is wrong. The liquid that had been engineered to transfer from smooth surfaces to human skin transferred from her wrists and was absorbed. The dose she received was, by subsequent assessment, larger than the dose the Skripals had received through contact with the door handle. Not because the concentration was different, but because she had applied a liquid directly to her skin rather than receiving secondary transfer from a contaminated solid surface. The difference in exposure method translated directly into a difference in outcomes likelihood. Dawn Sturgis was sick within 15 minutes. She was extremely unwell within the hour. Charlie Rowley, who had also had some contact with the bottle during the process of opening and presenting it, fell ill within hours of dawn. He was not as severely affected as she was in the initial hours, but the progression of his condition was serious enough that he too required intensive care. Emergency services were called first for Dawn, then for Charlie. The same Salisbury District Hospital that had treated the Skripals and Nick Bailey was receiving, for months later, 2 more casualties from what was now understood to be the same weapon, the same operation, the same unrecovered delivery mechanism. Dawn Sturgis was moved to intensive care. She was 47 years old. She had a life that had involved considerable difficulty. Reports described periods of homelessness and the challenges that come with it, but she also had relationships, connections, a family who cared about her. She had 3 children. She had Charlie. On the last day of June, she had been given what looked like a gift. The morning of July 1st brought the same catastrophic neurological collapse that the Skripals had experienced, the same unbearable storm inside the nervous system, the same racing toward the edge of the physiological capacity that the body has for self-maintenance. She was in intensive care for 8 days. On July 8, 2018, Dawn Sturgis died. She was the only person who died as a result of the Salisbury poisoning operation. She had never met Sergei Skripal. She had no connection to Russian intelligence, to British intelligence, to the GRU, to any of the professional antagonisms and historical grievances that had set the machinery of the operation in motion. She had found a perfume bottle and used it. That was the totality of her involvement. Her death changed the legal classification of the events of March 2018. What had been attempted murder became, in the case of Dawn Sturgis, murder. The men whose passports said Petrov and Bashirov, who were by then publicly identified as Chepiga and Mishkin, were additionally charged with her murder. The gravity of a charge is not diminished by the impossibility of its enforcement. It sits in the record, says what happened and who did it. It waits, with the patience of the law, for something that may never come. Charlie Rowley survived. His recovery was slower than the Skripals had been, given the intensity of his exposure, and the aftermath of Novichok poisoning left its trace in him in the ways that acute nervous system assault tends to do. Not dramatic permanent disability in his case, but the kind of residual fragility, the ongoing fatigue, the cognitive effects that distribute themselves unpredictably across a person's life and require constant management. He spoke publicly, in the months after Dawn's death, with a directness that was painful to read. He was angry. He was grieving. He was living with the understanding that he had inadvertently placed in his partner's hands the instrument of her death, and that the people responsible for putting that instrument in a position where he could find it were living safely in Moscow with no intention of ever facing a court. The perfume bottle was identified and recovered from Rowley's flat. It was analyzed. It was confirmed as the delivery mechanism used in the March attack, the same bottle or one precisely identical in construction, containing the same compound. Its presence in Amesbury for months after March 4th was the direct result of an operational choice by the GRU team to discard it in a way that made it accessible to a civilian. This was not an accident in the technical sense. The discard of the weapon after use is an operational step, a decision made in the field about how to manage a piece of equipment that can no longer be safely transported out of the country. Where it was discarded, by whom, and under what specific circumstances were reconstructed from the investigation but not fully disclosed publicly. What the investigation established was that the bottle had made its way from wherever the team discarded it to wherever Charlie Rowley found it, and that the chain connecting those 2 points ran directly through the death of an innocent woman. Dawn Sturgis's death prompted the British government to announce a statutory public inquiry, a formal, legally constituted investigation with powers to compel disclosure and witness attendance, intended to establish the full facts of the Salisbury attack and its aftermath, including the question of what the government knew in advance, what opportunities existed to prevent the attack, and what failures of security or intelligence contributed to the outcome. The inquiry, eventually chaired by Lord Hughes of Ombersley, was a long time coming. Years passed between the announcement and the formal commencement of proceedings, but its establishment represented an acknowledgement that the answers owed to the dead and the survivors required a process with more authority than ordinary journalism or parliamentary scrutiny could provide. Dawn Sturgis's name sits in the documentary record of the Salisbury poisoning alongside the Skripals and Nick Bailey, but it occupies a different place in the narrative of the event. She was not a target. She was not a casualty of a confrontation she had chosen. She was someone who happened to be in a particular relationship, in a particular town, close enough to the residue of an operation conducted by a foreign state on English soil that the residue reached her. The Russian government, asked about her death, denied all responsibility. The denial was as accurate in the operational sense as every other Russian denial connected to Salisbury. Technically specific and practically meaningless, a precise calibration of what can be said in public that obscures all of what actually happened. The unit that planned and executed the Salisbury operation did not come into existence for Skripal. By the time Chepiga and Mishkin flew into Heathrow in March 2018, Unit 29155 had been operating for years, accumulating a record of activities that subsequent investigations would piece together from open sources with a thoroughness that the unit's designers had clearly not anticipated. The picture that emerged was not of an improvisational response to individual targets, but of a systematic program of extraterritorial operations conducted by a standing capability within the GRU, a capability specifically created for the kind of work that cannot be assigned to regular intelligence station officers or to conventional military units, work that requires officers comfortable with extreme risk, authorized to operate outside all ordinary institutional constraints. The earliest documented activity attributed to the unit dates from the period around 2015 in Bulgaria. Emelian Jebrov, a Bulgarian arms dealer with known connections to Ukraine, was poisoned on 3 separate occasions between 2015 and 2016, surviving each time, though the poisonings nearly killed him more than once. Bellingcat and the insider's subsequent investigation into his case, conducted after their Salisbury work, gave them both the methodology and the contact access to investigate parallel events, identified Denis Sergeyev, the same individual who is assessed as the coordinating officer for the Salisbury operation, as having been in Bulgaria during the periods corresponding to Jebrov's poisonings. The compound used against him was not definitively identified publicly, but the clinical presentation and investigative trail was consistent with the same operational template later used in Salisbury. Other activities attributed to Unit 29155, through investigative work published by Bellingcat and partner organizations from 2019 onward, include attempts to destabilize the government of Montenegro ahead of its NATO membership bid, involvement in a plot in Moldova, and a broader pattern of European operations involving surveillance, influence operations, and in some cases direct physical action against individuals assessed to be hostile to Russian interests. The unit functioned, in the picture assembled by these investigations, as the GRU's Executive Action Directorate, the body that translates political and security policy decisions into operations that exceed what ordinary intelligence collection or analysis can accomplish. The operational structure of Unit 29155 appears, from the available evidence, to combine a core of career GRU officers with a broader pool of contract personnel and operational support drawn from the GRU's administrative and technical resources. The officers who conduct operations abroad carry false passports, but are registered under their real identities in the internal GRU system that manages their assignments and their compensation. The hero of the Russian Federation award that Chepiga received in 2014 would have been registered in that internal system, creating the paper trail, the juxtaposition of his real name against an official honor he could not publicly acknowledge, that made his identification possible to researchers who knew what juxtapositions to look for. This is one of the fundamental tensions in any state program of this kind. The operations themselves are designed for maximum deniability. False passports, cover stories, methods chosen for their ambiguity. But the human beings who conduct the operations exist within an institutional system that rewards, promotes, and documents them in ways that state bureaucracy finds unavoidable. Awards need to be registered. Pay needs to be processed. Medical records need to be maintained. Career files need to be updated with every posting and every promotion. The documentation that an institution produces in managing its personnel is inherently more extensive than any individual's cover legend, and the gap between the two is exploitable by anyone with the right combination of sources and analytical method. The commanding officer of Unit 29155 was identified in subsequent investigative reporting as Major General Andrei Avryanov, a GRU officer with a career biography that, in the fragments recovered from open sources, reads as a consistent pattern of assignments to sensitive special operations functions. He is not a man with a significant public profile. He is, or was at the time of the Salisbury investigation, exactly the kind of officer that a state security bureaucracy places in command of its most sensitive capabilities, experienced, decorated, discreet, and entirely comfortable with a range of actions that the official organs of the Russian government would deny all knowledge of if those actions became publicly attributable. The broader context for Unit 29155's activities is the reassertion of Russian state power in the European security environment following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, an event that represents, in the Russian strategic analysis, a decisive rejection of the post-Cold War security architecture that had constrained Russian options for the preceding 2 decades. From the Russian government's perspective, the 2014 annexation was a corrective to the humiliations of the 1990s, the eastward expansion of NATO, the perceived structural disadvantage of a state that had lost territory and influence without gaining any formal security guarantees in return. The operations that followed in eastern Ukraine, in Syria, in the hybrid information and cyber operations conducted in European elections, and in the physical actions of units like 29155, were all expressions of a single strategic posture: the determination to operate outside the rules-based international order when Russian interests were assessed to require it, and to do so in ways calibrated to remain below the threshold that would produce a military response. The specific place of assassination programs in this strategy is connected to the management of what Russian security doctrine calls the inner front, the threat posed by Russian citizens who have defected, dissented, or provided assistance to foreign intelligence services and who continue, from their exile or their foreign locations, to pose reputational, operational, or inspirational risks to the Russian state. Some of the individuals targeted by state-sanctioned violence are assessed to have ongoing intelligence value to Western services. Others have become symbolic figures for Russian opposition communities in exile. Some, like Sergei Skripal, are both former intelligence assets who are also representatives of the idea that a person can work against Russia and survive. The elimination of that idea, the demonstration that survival is temporary and that the ledger is never closed, serves a purpose that goes beyond the individual target. Every Russian national currently providing information to a Western service, every dissident operating from a Western capital, every former officer living under a Western protection arrangement, receives the demonstrative message of each operation. The message is consistent. Location is not protection. Time is not protection. Official exchange is not protection. The only protection there is, the only guarantee worth relying on, is not to betray the state in the first place. This creates, for Western intelligence services, a specific and deeply problematic consequence. The recruitment and retention of Russian sources depends on those sources accepting a risk assessment about their eventual safety. If that risk assessment is systematically undermined by the visible pattern of the Russian state's behavior, if it can be demonstrated through Litvinenko, through Skripal, through the Bulgarian cases, through the pattern of deaths among Russian exiles in the UK that have attracted investigative attention over the years, then the calculus around working for Western intelligence changes for potential Russian sources. Not necessarily in ways that prevent recruitment entirely, but in ways that affect the profile of who is willing to accept those risks, what they require in terms of guarantees and protection, and what the long-term sustainability of those relationships looks like. Western intelligence services have had to grapple with this consequence in their own institutional planning. How do you protect assets and former assets when the adversary has demonstrated a willingness to conduct assassination operations in your capital cities? What do the protection arrangements actually consist of, and what are their limits? The Skripal case demonstrated with painful clarity that the informal convention of not targeting exchanged officers was not a constraint that Russia was prepared to honor indefinitely. The convention had been functional while it served Russian interests. When some calculation changed, whether it was political pressure connected to the 2018 elections or a reassessment of the threat that Skripal's continued consulting work posed, or simply the accumulated weight of years of grudge that Russian security culture sustains with impressive tenacity, the convention was set aside. The response of Western intelligence services to this demonstration was necessarily multi-layered. Some of it is classified and will remain so. Some of it involved the reinforcement of protection arrangements for individuals assessed to be at elevated risk following Salisbury. Some of it involved a hardening of assessments about Russian intentions that affected diplomatic and policy positions well beyond the intelligence community itself. The full scope of what changed within classified programs in the aftermath of Salisbury has not been and will not be publicly disclosed. What has been evident in the years since is that the British and Allied governments emerged from the experience with a significantly revised understanding of what Russia's security doctrine looks like in practice, and a corresponding revision in how they manage the obligations they carry toward those who work with them and trust them with their lives. The public inquiry into the events in Salisbury, formally titled the Salisbury Novichok Inquiry and chaired by Lord Hughes of Ombersley, a retired Supreme Court justice, represents the most thorough official attempt to establish the complete record of what happened and what the British government knew, should have known, and could have done differently. Its establishment was announced by the government in 2021, following years of pressure from Don Sturgis's family and from Salisbury's representatives in Parliament, who argued that an investigation with the compulsory powers of a statutory inquiry was the minimum owed to the dead, the injured, and the community that had been used as the site of a state assassination attempt without its knowledge or consent. The inquiry has powers that ordinary journalism and parliamentary scrutiny do not. It can compel the attendance of witnesses, require the disclosure of classified documents under controlled conditions, and examine the security and intelligence record in ways that would otherwise remain permanently off-limits. Dawn Sturgis's family had been campaigning for exactly this kind of process since her death, driven by a straightforward proposition that a 47-year-old woman had been killed by a weapon that a foreign state left lying in their community, and that the public had a right to know everything that could be established about how that became possible. The inquiry's proceedings have proceeded over a period of years, examining witnesses from across the intelligence and security community, the emergency services, the medical response, and the diplomatic response. Some of those proceedings have been held in public. Others have required closed sessions to accommodate the classified nature of the material involved. The combination is an imperfect compromise between the competing demands of transparency and operational security, but it represents a genuine effort to push the official record as far toward completeness as the law allows. The questions it has been examining are ones that the public record, even without classified access, raises with considerable force. Was there intelligence in the period before March 2018 that indicated Russian planning for an operation against Skripal? If so, how was it assessed and actioned? Were there gaps in the protection arrangements for exchanged intelligence officers that the attack exploited? Were there opportunities to intercept or disrupt the operation before the Novichok was applied to the door handle? And if those opportunities existed, why were they not taken? These are not comfortable questions for any government to have examined by a statutory inquiry with evidence compulsion powers. They are, however, exactly the right questions. For Nick Bailey, the road after Salisbury tested him in ways he had not anticipated from the moment the acute phase of his poisoning ended. He had survived, which was more than Dawn Sturgis managed, and he was capable of returning to the surface of his life in ways that her family could not. But survival from Novichok poisoning and the resumption of a functioning life are very different things. The neurological aftermath of acute organophosphate exposure at the level he experienced does not simply resolve with time. It distributes itself across the recovered person's life in ways that are difficult to predict from outside. The cognitive fog that comes and goes without warning, the fatigue that falls suddenly and heavily, the anxiety that the experience of believing you are dying can leave behind as a permanent altered state, the way that a body that has been through that event relates to stress and demand in the years afterward. Bailey resigned from Wiltshire Police in 2020, 12 years before he would otherwise have retired. He was specific in his public statements about the decision, that it was the right choice for him medically and personally, and he used the platform his experience gave him to speak about the sustained support needs of people who survive critical injuries, not merely the medical acute phase which receives resources and attention, but the long underfunded, insufficiently understood process of living with the consequences afterward. He became an advocate. He spoke in public about the Salisbury attack and about the state that ordered it with the plain directness of a man who has no personal reason to soften his language. He named what had been done and who had done it. He described, in terms that the most careful diplomatic formulations could not match for clarity, what it means for a person and a family when a foreign state sends a murder team into a quiet English city and leaves behind a weapon that a police officer working in emergency response can inadvertently pick up. Sergei Skripal's whereabouts in the years since his discharge from Salisbury District Hospital have not been publicly confirmed. He has not made public statements. He has not appeared in press interviews. His location is managed by the British security services with the precautions appropriate to someone who was the target of a state assassination attempt and who, despite the operation's failure, has no reason to assume that the intent behind it has changed. He is, by whatever measure can be applied, alive. He is somewhere. The life he had in Salisbury, the house, the guinea pigs, the pub, the cathedral town, is gone entirely. The house on Christie Miller Road was eventually remediated and sold. The decontamination work completed by hazmat specialists working in full protective equipment to strip the building down to surfaces that could be confirmed clean according to established thresholds. Whether the house feels to its new owners like a house with a past is a matter for them. Yulia Skripal made a single public statement following her discharge from hospital, read on her behalf, expressing gratitude to the medical staff and declining further comment. She subsequently established a new life in a location not publicly confirmed. She gave one brief, composed interview to Reuters in May 2018, in which she described a recovery that was slow and painfully rendered, and expressed hope for a normal life in a future she did not specify. Since then, she has maintained the privacy that the circumstances demand, which is both understandable and, from the perspective of the public record, a loss because the story she could tell from the inside of the experience, if she ever chose to tell it, would be one of the most vivid accounts of the collision between ordinary life and state violence in modern British history. Charlie Rowley has continued to live in the Amesbury area, close to where Dawn Sturgis died. He has spoken publicly many times about both his own survival and about Dawn, about who she was before the bottle, about the grief and the anger, about what it is to have been the inadvertent instrument of someone's death while being at the same time a victim of the same event. He has been consistent in his assessment of Russian responsibility and consistent in his anger that the men who made and dispensed the substance that killed Dawn remain free in Moscow. He attended events organized in Dawn's memory. He gave evidence to the public inquiry. The city of Salisbury itself has managed the aftermath with the particular resilience of a community that did not ask to be the setting for an international incident but has had to find in itself the resources to carry it. The tourism which had previously been organized largely around the cathedral and Stonehenge took a temporary hit in 2018 as the decontaminations and cordons made the city center difficult and as the media attention attached to the most visible signs of crisis rather than the city's own character. But visitors returned. The restaurants returned to operation. The bench in the maltings where Sergei and Yulia were found has been replaced in the years since. The original, along with surrounding ground material, was removed as part of the remediation process. The new bench sits in the same place. People sit on it without, for the most part, thinking about what happened there. The cathedral city of Salisbury is 900 years old. It has absorbed the Black Death, the English Civil War, the Industrial Revolution, the bombings of the Second World War, the slow revisions of 24 governing ideologies. What happened here on a Sunday afternoon in March 2018 is inscribed in its history now alongside all of that. A date and a place where the longest, coldest war of all reached into the most ordinary of English settings and demonstrated what it is prepared to do when it chooses. The spire still stands. The Magna Carta still sits in the cathedral chapter house, sealed in its glass case, 700 years old and still legible, that earliest formal assertion that no power stands above the law, that authority carries obligations, and that the arbitrary exercise of force has a name and the name is tyranny. Whether that document and what it represents ever becomes practically relevant to the men who painted a door handle on Christie Miller Road remains one of the open questions of this story. The charges against them are filed. The evidence is documented. The names are public. And somewhere in Moscow, Anatoly Chepiga and Alexander Mishkin are living their lives, in the specific comfort of men who believe they are beyond reach. History has a longer memory than institutional impunity typically accounts for. How long this particular reckoning takes, and what form it eventually takes, is a story that has not yet been written. The full picture of what the Salisbury poisoning produced, in diplomatic terms, in institutional terms, in the personal lives of the people it directly touched, resists any clean resolution because clean resolutions are not what this kind of event tends to produce. The world does not rearrange itself into order following a state assassination attempt in an English cathedral town. It accommodates the event into its ongoing patterns of complexity, and life continues at varying distances from the point of impact, with varying degrees of disruption, and with varying timelines for whatever return to normality becomes possible. What changed most visibly was the bilateral relationship between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation, which was already under considerable strain following the annexation of Crimea and the Litvinenko inquiry's conclusions, and which effectively reached a state of managed hostility from which it has not recovered. The formal diplomatic channels remain nominally open. Ambassadors are exchanged, formal communications are sent. The United Nations framework continues to provide a forum in which representatives of both states appear at the same table. But the substance of the relationship, the cooperative and commercial and cultural dimensions that had been developing through the late 1990s and 2000s and that had survived even the Litvinenko period in a truncated form, was effectively suspended. Investment, institutional cooperation, joint academic and scientific programs, the texture of normal state relations under which intelligence hostilities are typically managed, contracted dramatically in the aftermath of Salisbury and contracted further with each subsequent Russian action that reinforced the same essential picture. For British intelligence and security services, Salisbury was an event that went several steps beyond the Litvinenko case in its implications for how Russian state behavior is understood and planned against. The Litvinenko poisoning was extraordinary in its method and its brazenness, but it was conducted against a specific individual with a specific profile, a former FSB officer who had publicly accused his former service of serious crimes and who was actively cooperating with both Spanish and British intelligence investigations. The targeting rationale, however unacceptable its expression, was legible within the framework of Russian security culture's logic. The Salisbury attack was different in a way that expanded the risk assessment considerably. Skripal had been formally exchanged. He had been, by the norms of intelligence practice, moved off the active target list by the mechanism of the swap itself. His targeting demonstrated that the exchange mechanism, one of the few structural features of the intelligence adversarial relationship that served both sides, was not a permanent guarantee but a conditional one, revocable by political decision regardless of what it had previously represented. This has practical consequences for how Western intelligence services approach future swaps, future extraction arrangements, and future protection commitments. The people who may in future be offered exchange or extraction live now with a data point that earlier generations of similar individuals did not have. The explicit, documented case of a man who was formally exchanged, who lived quietly in a Western country for 8 years, and who was still targeted with a nerve agent. The protection offered is real but evidently limited. The commitment to safety has boundaries that the adversary is prepared to test. Any individual assessing whether to accept Western protection now does so with a more complete picture of what it actually means in practice, and that picture is more sobering than its predecessors. The Chemical Weapons Convention's response to Salisbury was the clearest international institutional consequence of the attack in the immediate period. The OPCW's Governing Council, meeting in April 2018, adopted a decision that expanded the organization's investigative mandate to include the formal attribution of responsibility for chemical weapons use, a significant expansion of its remit that Russian and Syrian delegates voted against but were outvoted. The extension of OPCW powers in this direction was a direct result of Salisbury and of the Syrian government's repeated use of chemical weapons, which had similarly evaded attribution through the limitations of the existing mandate. Russia's response to the mandate expansion was to attempt to disrupt the vote, including a remarkable incident in which GRU officers were caught outside OPCW headquarters in The Hague with technical equipment assessed as being deployed for an attempted hacking operation against the organization. The Dutch Military Intelligence Service made the arrests and the Dutch government publicly identified the individuals, all of whom were GRU officers, and expelled them. It was, as one analyst commented at the time, a demonstration of the specific kind of overconfidence that results from an institution that has operated for years with very little consequence for its actions. The expansion of OPCW's mandate was a meaningful institutional development, but meaningful institutional development is not the same as deterrence. Russia has continued to assert that it bears no responsibility for Salisbury, for Dawn Sturgis's death, for the Litvinenko poisoning, for chemical weapons use in Syria, or for any of the other events that the sustained body of evidence connects to Russian state actions. The gap between what the evidence shows and what the Russian government says about it is so consistent and so total that it has become a feature of the diplomatic landscape rather than a point of genuine dispute. Russia does not argue about the evidence. It denies the framework in which the evidence exists. This is a posture that closes off certain kinds of engagement while leaving others, the formal diplomatic ones, the commercial ones, the channels through which states manage the minimum functional relationship, intact enough to serve as communication pathways. For those who work to document what happened in Salisbury, the investigators of Counterterrorism Command, the forensic scientists at Porton Down, the OPCW inspectors, and the open-source investigators at Bellingcat and the insider who pushed beyond the official record into the organizational architecture behind the operation, the case represents a kind of landmark in the history of attribution. Before Salisbury, the conventional wisdom in intelligence analysis circles held that highly professional state operations could be documented in general terms, connected to a state, but not reliably attributed to specific individuals or organizational structures. The assumption was that the combination of false documentation, disciplined operational security, and the limits of open-source access created a practical ceiling on how specific attribution could become. Salisbury broke that ceiling. Not through classified intelligence alone, the combination of classified and open-source work produced the identification, and not through official processes working within institutional constraints, but through the specific methodology of rigorous open-source investigation applied with extraordinary discipline to a specific evidentiary problem. The names Chepiga and Mishkin and Sergeyev, the unit designation, the command structure, the pattern of European operations, all of this entered the public domain through the work of journalists and analysts who did not have security clearances and did not need them for the specific purpose at hand. The lesson for state actors conducting covert operations is a difficult one to operationalize. You cannot redact the world. The legacy of Salisbury runs, ultimately, in two directions simultaneously, toward accountability and away from it, at the same time with different outcomes realizable in different timescales. The accountability achieved was documentary, analytical, institutional. The record is complete, the identities established, the charges filed, the inquiry underway, the expansion of OPCW's mandate achieved. These are real things. They exist in the permanent record and they cannot be undone. The accountability that has not been achieved is carceral and punitive. The men responsible for applying a military nerve agent to a residential door handle, and for transporting it to England in a way that eventually killed an innocent woman, remain free and are presumably still employed by the GRU in functions appropriate to their rank and capabilities. Whether those two trajectories eventually converge, whether the documented accountability becomes a predicate for something more consequential, as political circumstances change and as the international community's tolerance for certain kinds of Russian behavior shifts, is the question that hangs over the Salisbury story wherever it enters the present tense. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022. The GRU was centrally involved in the planning and early execution of that invasion. The individuals and institutions that planned the Salisbury attack are, in the most fundamental sense, continuous with the Russian state apparatus that launched a full conventional war against a neighboring country 4 years later. The thread between the door handle on Christie Miller Road and the infrastructure of a larger catastrophe is not a metaphorical one. It runs through the same institution, the same command culture, and the same fundamental assessment of what Russia can do in the world and what consequences it can accept. Salisbury is not a story with an ending, because the forces that produced it have not been resolved. It is a story in a longer arc, a chapter in a conflict that has been going on since before the bench at the Maltings, before Christy Miller Road, before the spy swap at Vienna Airport, before Sergei Skripal picked up the telephone in the GRU personnel office and made the decision that would define the rest of his life. What happened in this small English cathedral city on an ordinary Sunday afternoon in early March 2018 was an attempt to close a human account, to draw a final line under a choice made decades earlier by a man the Russian state believed it owned. The line was not final. The account was not closed. The man survived. But the attempt was real, and what it cost, in a woman's life, in a city's peace, in the long-term accounting of a civilization trying to maintain norms against a state that has decided norms are optional. That cost is still being paid by people who had nothing to do with any of it, and who simply happened to be living their ordinary lives in the path of something very old, very patient, and very cold.